Chapter 1. The Moonlit Ferry. The ferry moved across the water with deceptive calm, its broad hull cutting a dark, deliberate path through the lake. The night was cold but clear, the kind that sharpened sound and thought alike. Above, the moon hung fractured behind drifting clouds, appearing and disappearing as though uncertain whether it wished to be seen. Its light broke upon the surface of the water in trembling shards, never quite whole, never quite still. The ferry horn groaned, a long, low sound that carried across the lake like a warning issued too late to be useful. Hercule Poirot stood near the starboard railing, his gloved hands resting lightly upon the metal, his posture immaculate, despite the faint vibration of the engines beneath his feet. He gazed not at the distant shoreline, which was little more than a suggestion of shadow, but at the reflections below. He watched how the moonlight fractured when the water stirred, how ripples distorted what should have been straight. It was a habit of his to observe distortion. Truth, he believed, revealed itself most clearly when something interfered with it. Behind him, the passengers occupied themselves in the quiet, self-contained manner of people convinced that nothing of consequence would occur. There were perhaps 30 souls aboard, scattered across the open deck and the enclosed cabin. Some leaned against railings, collars turned up against the chill. Others sat with drinks balanced carefully in their hands, voices low, laughter restrained. This was not a festive crossing, but a practical one. An evening passage between two lakeside towns, familiar enough to invite complacency. Poirot had taken the ferry, not out of necessity but preference. He disliked motor cars at night and distrusted trains when sleep was expected of them. The ferry allowed for reflection. It moved at a pace that respected thought. Near the cabin doors stood a woman in a pale coat, her dark hair pinned with precision. She stared out at the water with an intensity that suggested she was looking inward rather than outward. A little distance away, two men spoke in murmurs, their heads inclined toward one another, in a posture of confidential agreement. Further along the deck, a young couple sat close together, their silence intimate rather than awkward. Poirot noticed them all, without appearing to notice anyone. He shifted his weight slightly as the ferry adjusted course. The moon emerged fully, then bright and cold, its reflection stretching across the lake in a silver path that seemed almost solid. For a moment, everything aligned. The water, the light, the steady thrum of the engines. It was the sort of moment that tempted one to believe in order. Then came the scream. It cut through the night with brutal clarity, a sharp, ragged sound that seemed to tear the air itself. It was followed instantly by the shattering of glass, the crash unmistakable, even before its echo faded. Someone gasped. Another voice cried out, incoherent. The engine's hum continued, indifferent. Poirot did not move. He did not startle, nor did he turn immediately toward the source of the sound. Instead, he listened. To the quality of the scream, to its duration, to the way it ended abruptly rather than trailing off. Screams, Poirot knew, were as individual as handwriting. A woman's scream, certainly shock rather than pain, fear rather than grief. Simone's fallen. A man shouted from near the cabin, "Overboard!" There was a rush of movement then. Chairs scraped, footsteps pounded across the deck. The ferry horn sounded again. Shorter this time, urgent lights flared to full brightness, banishing the subtle shadows that moonlight had cast. Poirot turned at last. Passengers clustered near the port side now, voices overlapping in confusion. The woman in the pale coat stood among them, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. The two men who had been speaking earlier were separated now, one gesturing animatedly, the other staring fixedly at the water. A steward pushed his way forward, calling for calm that no one heard. Poirot moved toward the group with quiet efficiency, neither hurrying nor delaying. He positioned himself slightly to one side, where he could see faces rather than backs. What happened? Someone demanded. I heard a scream. There was a crash. Someone had broke a glass. I saw a man near the railing. He slipped. No, he was pushed. The accounts tangled immediately, each speaker convinced of their own clarity. each contradicting the last. Poirot leaned slightly toward the woman in the pale coat. "Madam," he said gently. "You screamed." She nodded, her breath unsteady. "Yes, I was inside, near the window." "What did you see?" She swallowed. "A man. He was standing near the railing. Then he wasn't." Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to the spot she indicated. The railing there was intact, its metal cool and smooth. No obvious sign of struggle, no damage, no broken glass. "You saw him fall?" Poirot asked. "I saw him disappear," she said with quiet emphasis. "One moment he was there, the next, nothing." The distinction pleased Poirot. Behind them, a steward raised his voice. "Everyone, please remain calm. We are turning back. A search will be conducted." Another passenger interrupted angrily. "Who was it? Does anyone know who fell?" A silence followed. A small one, but significant. Poirot felt it settle like dust. "I think it was Mr. Hargreaves," said a man at last, uncertainly. "The gentleman in the dark overcoat. He was standing alone earlier." "Yes," another voice agreed. "I saw him too. He was drinking." "No, he wasn't." Poirot's gaze sharpened. He scanned the deck, counting instinctively. Faces he had observed earlier. Present, the young couple. Still together, the woman in the pale coat accounted for. The two men, both here, one space remained unfilled. "Was anyone with him?" Poirot asked quietly. No one answered at once. The moon slid behind a cloud, then, dimming the water once more. The bright lights of the ferry reflected harshly now, creating glare and shadow in equal measure. What had been subtle before was now stark. The captain emerged onto the deck, his expression tight. Orders were given. A lifebuoy was thrown into the water more out of procedure than hope. It was impossible to see anything beyond the fractured reflections of light. The lake gave nothing back. A man approached him, a broad, shouldered fellow with a ruddy complexion and an air of authority that suggested either business or habit. "You're the little gentleman who was standing here before," he said. "Did you see anything?" Poirot met his gaze calmly. "I saw reflections," he replied. They trembled. The man frowned. "Did you see the fall?" "No," Poirot said. "I heard the scream. So did we all." Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, but not all screams mean the same thing." The man stared at him for a moment, then shook his head and moved away, muttering about useless philosophers. Poirot remained at the railing. He adjusted his coat carefully, smoothing the fabric as though the night had disturbed its order. His mind, however, was already arranging what little he knew. A scream shattering glass. A missing man, contradictory accounts. No agreement on how it happened. And above all, no one who claimed to have seen the moment itself. Poirot turned slightly and addressed the nearest steward. "May I ask," he said politely, "whether all passengers have been accounted for?" The steward hesitated. "We are checking, sir. But yes, one man is missing. His name. We do not yet know his name for certain. Traveling alone, middle-aged. Booked a return ticket." Poirot nodded. "Did he have enemies?" The steward blinked. "On the ferry. I wouldn't know." Poirot smiled faintly. One never knows where one's enemies may appear. The search continued. Flashlights swept the water in futile arcs. Voices rose and fell. Explanations were proposed, abandoned, replaced. The ferry circled slowly, respectfully, as though honoring a ritual. Poirot stepped back from the railing and leaned against it lightly, his gaze drifting once more to the water. The moon re-emerged, then pale and watchful. Poirot studied its reflection, noting how the ripples broke it apart, how movement disguised shape. Water, he reflected, was an excellent accomplice. It erased evidence, swallowed sound, and encouraged assumption. He closed his eyes briefly. "No one agrees on how it happened," he murmured to himself. That, more than the scream, more than the missing man, told him everything he needed to know. This was not an accident born of chance. This was a moment, engineered to produce confusion, and Hercule Poirot who trusted clarity even when it arrived disguised as chaos, knew with absolute certainty that the night's calm had been an illusion. Somewhere on that ferry, amid the shaken passengers and fractured reflections, the truth stood waiting, silent, precise, and very much alive. Chapter 2. The vanished man. The lake did not give up its secrets readily. In the first minutes after the scream, the passengers behaved as people always did when suddenly confronted with the possibility of death in a setting that had promised only routine. They moved too quickly, spoke too much, and searched the wrong places with great confidence. Flashlights skimmed across the black water in sweeping arcs. A steward shouted instructions that were not heard. Someone threw a lifebuoy with such urgency that it struck the surface and vanished into darkness without ceremony. The ferry's horn sounded again, a deep complaint that echoed across the lake and returned faintly as though mocked by distance. Poirot watched without joining the clamor. He knew the lake would not yield a body simply because people demanded it. Water was patient, impartial, and infinitely practical. It did not conspire, but it served conspiracies well. The captain, an older man with a weathered face and a manner that suggested he had seen storms more honest than this, conferred with his crew near the wheelhouse. After a short, tense exchange, he emerged onto the deck and raised a hand for silence. "Listen," he called. "We've lost a passenger. We have already slowed and turned as much as safety allows. But the channel here is narrow, and the current is strong. We cannot keep circling. We've sent a call to the harbor and to the lake patrol. They'll meet us on the far shore. We will continue forward." A protest rose immediately. "You can't just go on. A man's in the water. What if he's still alive?" The captain's jaw tightened. "If he is, God help him. We will not make it worse by risking the vessel. We continue." His words were final. The ferry's engines deepened in tone, and with a slow inevitability that felt almost cruel, the vessel resumed its forward course. The wake widened behind it, like a torn seam in cloth, black water closing again with silent indifference. Poirot felt the shift. The moment when hope, however thin, was forced to surrender to reality. It was in that surrender that truth often began to breathe. The passengers drifted back into uneasy clusters. Some stared at the water as though willing it to reveal what it had taken. Others turned away, suddenly anxious to distance themselves from the idea that they had been present. A few spoke loudly, as if volume could defend them against fear. Poirot moved among them with quiet deliberation. He did not ask dramatic questions. He did not insist. He simply listened. His small, neat figure passing like a calm current through turbulent human waters. Near one of the benches along the deck, a ledger lay abandoned. It was a plain book, bound in dark leather, with a strap that had snapped open. A few loose papers fluttered beneath it, trapped by a corner of the bench. It had not been tossed casually. It had been left in haste. Poirot knelt beside it. The name on the first page was written in careful block letters, Marcus Hale. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. So the missing man was not the Mr. Hargreaves the passengers had guessed at earlier. That itself was interesting. In moments of confusion, people often reached for the nearest certainty they could find. Names that sounded right, faces that had been noticed briefly, assumptions formed from nothing more than appearance. He lifted the ledger with care and glanced at the pages. Columns of figures. Notes in a tidy hand, references to shipments, weights, and dates. It was the sort of book kept by a man who valued order and proof, someone accustomed to being believed because he could point to facts on paper. Poirot set it back down exactly where he had found it. Then he rose and looked around. A young steward approached, his face tense. "Sir, are you a policeman?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I am something like that. We're trying to identify the missing passenger properly. People are saying different things, but we have the ticket ledger. The name is Marcus Hale." "Yes," Poirot said, "and this ledger here agrees." The steward nodded quickly. He boarded at the north dock alone. Quiet, hardly spoke. "We didn't think." He stopped, swallowing. Poirot's tone remained gentle. "No one thinks until they must." The steward glanced around nervously. "We've asked if anyone knows him. Some do, a little. but their stories. He shook his head. Poirot lifted an eyebrow. Contradictions? Yes, immediately. Poirot nodded. Contradictions were not merely obstacles, they were signposts. The truth hid where the accounts diverged. He moved toward a group gathered near the cabin doors. A man with a thick scarf and an agitated manner was speaking loudly. His cheeks flushed with indignation. "I tell you, he was drunk," the man insisted. "Completely drunk. I heard him slurring. I did. He was swaying like a reed." Another passenger, older, composed, with spectacles perched low on his nose, shook his head firmly. "Nonsense. I sat near him for nearly 10 minutes. He was perfectly calm. He didn't even have a drink." The agitated man scoffed. "You didn't see what I saw, and you did not see what I saw," the older man replied. His voice clipped. Poirot stepped closer. "Gentlemen," he said politely, "you both speak with certainty." They turned, startled, taking in Poirot's small figure and composed expression. "I speak with certainty because I heard him argue," the scarfed man said, as though that settled all questions. "Argue?" Poirot repeated softly. "Yes," loudly, with a fellow in a grey coat, right near the rail. Hale was furious. His voice carried. The older man's brows lifted. "That is simply untrue. He never spoke at all." He sat quietly, looking at his papers. Poirot inclined his head. "You say he never spoke at all?" "Not a word," the older man insisted. "He was withdrawn." Poirot's eyes moved from one face to the other. He noted the scarfed man's agitation, how it seemed fueled as much by excitement as by conviction. He noted the older man's calm, and how it might conceal stubbornness rather than accuracy. "Where were you sitting?" Poirot asked the older man. "On the bench near the life ring. Right there," he pointed. Poirot turned to the scarfed man. "And you?" "Near the cabin doors." Poirot nodded. "Two positions, two angles of sight, two different truths, or two different performances." A woman stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm. She was in her 40s, dressed neatly, with an expression of controlled distress. "I saw him earlier," she said. "He was afraid of the water." Both men glanced at her. The scarfed man snorted. The older man looked surprised. Poirot addressed her gently. "Afraid? How do you know?" She pressed her lips together, as though replaying the memory. He stood near the railing, but he never looked down. Not once. He kept his hands tight on the metal. His face was pale. I thought he might be ill, but then I heard him say, very softly, that he hated boats. Poirot's gaze sharpened. He spoke then. "Yes," she replied. "To me, just a little." I tried to reassure him, but he seemed distracted, as though he had something on his mind. The older man frowned. "That is impossible." He did not speak. Poirot smiled faintly. "It is not impossible, monsieur. It is merely inconvenient to your certainty." The older man bristled. "I know what I saw." Poirot's tone remained mild. "Of course. But what one sees is not always what is happening." He excused himself and moved away, leaving the argument to exhaust itself. Near the stern, he found a young couple huddled together, the woman pale and trembling. Poirot approached softly. "You were on deck when the scream occurred?" he asked. The man nodded. "Yes, we were sitting. We heard it, and then everyone ran." "Did you see Mr. Hale?" The woman swallowed. "I saw a man near the rail. Yes, but I can't be sure it was him." Poirot tilted his head. "What did you notice?" She frowned, concentrating. His coat, dark, and something in his hand. Poirot leaned closer. "What thing?" She shook her head, frustrated. "I don't know. It was small. Maybe a paper. Or," she stopped, eyes widening, "or a bottle." The man squeezed her hand. "Don't guess." Poirot nodded approvingly. A wise instruction. He left them and continued his slow circuit of the ferry. The vessel moved steadily forward now, unable to turn back, its course fixed. That, Poirot reflected, was another kind of pressure, when people realized there would be no return. Their minds sought other outlets: blame, explanation, narrative. The steward returned, holding a clipboard. "Sir, we've confirmed the missing passenger is Marcus Hale, trader, quiet type. Usually travels this route once a week. People say he deals in shipping permits, paperwork, contracts, permits," Poirot murmured. "Paper." The steward nodded. "He was carrying a case, too. A small leather case. We can't find it." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you have found his ledger?" "Yes." Poirot glanced back toward the bench where it lay. Then the ledger was left behind. "The case is missing. Interesting." He walked to the bench again and examined the area more carefully. The wood was damp with lake air. A faint ring marked where a glass had stood. A smear of liquid, perhaps spilled, trailed toward the edge. It was not water. It had a faint amber tint. Poirot touched it lightly with his fingertip and smelled. Not alcohol, tea, perhaps. Or something sweetened. The scent was faint but distinct. He straightened and looked toward the cabin doors, where the scarfed man still spoke loudly, reenacting the alleged argument with dramatic gestures. Poirot's gaze drifted instead to those who were not speaking. A thin man with close, cropped hair stood alone near the wheelhouse, his hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. A faint flash of white cuff showed at his wrist, too neat for a laborer, and something small and silver winked there when he shifted. He held a lidded paper cup that carried a faint, sweet scent. As a steward passed, he heard the man addressed once, quietly and without ceremony, "Mr. Vane." He looked like someone hoping to disappear into anonymity. Poirot noted him but did not approach yet. Nearby, a woman in a dark hat sat stiffly, her gloved hands folded in her lap, staring at the deck as though counting the boards. She had not joined any group. She had not offered any opinion. Silence, Poirot knew, could be the loudest voice of all. He returned to the steward. "Tell me," Poirot said gently, "who was the first to shout that a man had fallen?" The steward blinked. "I, summoning near the cabin doors. A passenger." It spread quickly. "And who screamed?" Poirot asked. "The woman in the pale coat." She admitted it. Poirot nodded. "Yes. And the glass that shattered, do we know whose it was?" The steward shook his head. "Number people were holding drinks. Someone dropped one." Poirot looked once more toward the water. Black and indifferent, the moonlight now broken by the ferry's wake. "Certainty," Poirot murmured softly, more to himself than to the steward, "is often false." He had heard 3 accounts of Marcus Hale already. That he was drunk and shouting, that he was silent and calm, that he feared the water. Each speaker had been convinced. Each voice had carried certainty like a shield. Poirot understood the purpose of such certainty. It was not to clarify the truth, but to claim it, to occupy it so that others could not. The ferry continued forward, unable to turn back, carrying with it a collection of frightened, self-assured witnesses and one missing man whose quiet life had suddenly become the loudest fact on board. Poirot returned to the railing and watched the moon's fractured reflection tremble again. A vanished man, he thought, was rarely as simple as a fall, and contradictions like ripples always began somewhere. Chapter 3. The widow's memory. The ferry continued its steady passage through the night, the engines maintaining their rhythm with mechanical indifference. The lake lay stretched beneath the fractured moon, dark and inscrutable, as though it had already absorbed the disturbance and found it unworthy of comment. Eleanor Hale had removed her pale coat. In its place she wore a dark woolen shawl drawn tight against the chill, as though cloth could hold a life together. On deck, however, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to something more unsettled, an uneasy vigilance, a collective awareness that nothing said from this moment onward would ever be entirely innocent. Hercule Poirot requested, with gentle insistence, the use of a small sitting area just inside the cabin. It was not an interrogation room, nor did he wish it to become one. He preferred spaces that allowed memory to unfold, rather than defend itself. The area contained 2 narrow sofas, facing one another, a small table bolted to the floor, and a lamp whose yellow light softened edges and encouraged confidence. It was here that Eleanor Hale sat, her posture upright, her hands clasped tightly around the ends of a dark woolen shawl. She was the widow. The revelation had come quietly, when the steward had read the missing man's name aloud, Marcus Hale. She had not cried out, nor had she fainted or protested. She had simply gone very still, as though something inside her had drawn inward and closed a door. Poirot had noticed at once. Grief, he knew, had many expressions, but recognition always left its mark. Now, as she sat opposite him, Eleanor Hale appeared composed in the way of someone long practiced in restraint. She was perhaps in her early 40s, her face pale but well kept, her dark hair pinned with careful precision beneath a modest hat she had not removed. Only her hands betrayed her. They worried the shawl constantly, twisting the fabric, tightening and loosening their grip in a restless rhythm. Poirot observed this without comment. "Mrs. Hale," Poirot said gently, "I am very sorry for your distress." She inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." Her voice was low, steady, but carried an undercurrent of strain, like a wire pulled too tight. "You knew your husband was traveling on this ferry?" Poirot asked. "Yes," she replied. "We often crossed together. Tonight." He went ahead. "I followed later." Poirot nodded. "You were not seated together." "Number he wished to stand on deck. He said the air would help him think." Poirot's eyes sharpened slightly. He was troubled then. Her fingers tightened on the shawl. "Yes." Poirot waited. "He had been uneasy for days," she continued, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond Poirot's shoulder. "Distracted. He said there were complications." "Of what nature?" Poirot asked. She hesitated. "Busyness. Always business." Poirot accepted this for the moment. "You were on deck when the scream occurred?" "Yes. And before that?" "I saw Marcus near the railing," she said. "He was standing very stiffly. His shoulders were tense. I remember thinking he looked like a man waiting for something unpleasant." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his manner encouraging rather than pressing. "Did you speak to him?" "No," she said quickly. Then, after a pause, "Not then." Poirot noted the correction. She drew the shawl closer around her shoulders, as though the memory itself were cold. "Because I saw him turn," she whispered. "He turned suddenly, as if someone had spoken his name, his face." She stopped, swallowing. He looked frightened. Poirot remained silent, allowing the image to settle. "You believe he was threatened?" Poirot said quietly. "Yes," she replied, with immediate conviction. He was threatened. Poirot tilted his head. "By whom?" She shook her head. "I don't know. I didn't see a face. But you saw someone?" "Yes." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "A shadow behind him." Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to her hands, still twisting the shawl, then back to her face. "A shadow," he repeated. "Yes, taller than him. Close. Too close." Poirot nodded, slowly. "And this shadow, what did it do?" "It loomed," she said, the word chosen with care, as if pressing him forward. Marcus stepped back. "That is when I screamed." Poirot waited again. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the engines and the muted sounds of passengers moving outside. "No one else has mentioned this figure," Poirot said at last. Her eyes flickered. They were not looking. "That is possible," Poirot agreed mildly. "Yet several people were on deck. They were distracted," she insisted. "Talking, drinking. No one was watching Marcus as closely as I was." Poirot inclined his head. "Naturally." He studied her now with particular attention. Her face was drawn, but her eyes were bright, too bright perhaps. Her pupils were dilated, her breathing controlled but shallow. Fear lingered there, unmistakably. But Poirot sensed something else beneath it, something sharper, more personal. "Mrs. Hale," Poirot said softly, "your hands are trembling." She glanced down, startled, as though only now becoming aware of them. She loosened her grip on the shawl, then tightened it again. "I am frightened," she said. "My husband is gone." "Yes," Poirot replied, "but fear has many objects." She looked up sharply, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were dark, glistening in the lamplight. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Poirot smiled faintly, reassuringly. "I suggest nothing, I observe." He leaned back slightly. "Tell me, did Marcus Hale fear the water?" She blinked. "Yes, he disliked boats." Poirot nodded. "Others have said the same." She drew a slow breath. He could not swim. He told me once that water felt final to him, that it allowed no argument. Poirot's eyes softened, and yet he stood at the railing. "He had to," she said quickly. "He said he needed air." Poirot noted the speed of the response. "You say he was frightened," Poirot continued. "Was this fear new?" Her gaze dropped to the table. "Numbered. Did he fear someone in particular?" She hesitated. "He said he was being followed." Poirot's expression remained calm. "By whom?" He didn't say. Her voice wavered. He said it was safer not to know. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Did he tell you why?" She shook her head. "Only that it concerned papers, documents he had refused to hand over." Poirot's mind moved swiftly now, aligning this with the missing leather case, the abandoned ledger, the nature of Hale's trade. "And tonight," Poirot asked, "did you see these papers?" She frowned. "Number he had his ledger, I believe. But the case..." She stopped. "The case is missing," Poirot said gently. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, as though she were calculating something she did not wish to voice. "Yes," she said. "He mentioned carrying it." Poirot allowed another pause. "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly, "when you describe the shadow behind your husband, you do not look at the railing." She stiffened. "You look instead at the deck." Her gaze flicked involuntarily downward. "That is where your eyes go," Poirot continued gently. "When you recall the moment, not outward, toward the water, but inward, toward the space between your feet and his." She swallowed. A tear gathered at the corner of her eye and slid down her cheek, catching the lamplight like a shard of the moon. She did not wipe it away. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Yes," Poirot said softly, "but not for Marcus alone. Number, I think you are remembering." "There is a difference," she said bitterly. "Indeed," Poirot replied. "Memory bends under emotion. It fills gaps. It protects us from what we cannot yet face." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I saw him turn. I saw fear. I screamed." Poirot nodded. "I do not doubt that." "And then he was gone," she said. "The scream, that was mine. The glass, that was someone else. Everything happened too quickly." Poirot leaned forward again. "Mrs. Hale, did you see your husband fall?" Her breath caught. She hesitated longer this time. "No," she said at last. "I did not see him fall." Poirot's voice was very gentle. "Then what did you see?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands tightened on the shawl once more, twisting the fabric until her knuckles whitened. "I saw him step back," she whispered, "into darkness." The words settled heavily between them. Poirot rose slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale. You have been very brave." She looked up at him, her eyes searching. "Will you find out what happened?" Poirot met her gaze steadily. "Yes." She nodded, as though she had expected no other answer. As Poirot stepped out of the sitting area, he glanced once more through the cabin window. The moon had emerged again, pale and watchful. Its reflection wavered across the lake, broken but persistent, behind him. Eleanor Hale sat alone, her memory still bending under the weight of fear. Fear not only of loss, but of what might yet surface when the water finally gave up its truth. Chapter 4. The sailor's certainty by the time the ferry had committed itself to the forward crossing, unable, as the captain had said with grim finality, to turn back without endangering the vessel. The mood aboard shifted into a new and subtler phase. The first shock had been raw, noisy, almost childish, a rush of bodies, a tangle of shouted questions, the frantic swing of flashlights over water that refused to reflect anything but the ferry's own glare. Now that hope had been forced to shrink into procedure, everyone began to behave, as though the truth might be managed by manners. People lowered their voices. They made room for one another with strained politeness. They stared at the black surface of the lake, not because they expected to see a man, but because they could not bear to look at each other too directly. The ferry itself, with its steady pulse of engines and its faint smell of oil and wet rope, continued as though it had not been interrupted at all. That mechanical indifference, Poirot thought, was often what made human fear so sharp. A machine could proceed without conscience. A person could not, unless they learned to perform it. Poirot had moved away from the railing and into the lighted cabin for a time. Not because he preferred it, but because he wished to watch the passengers from a different angle. On deck, the wind scattered words. In the cabin, it gathered them. The overhead lights were too bright, flattening faces into honesty or harshness, and the windows showed only black water and the occasional broken stripe of moonlight. He observed quietly how the groups formed. Those who feared guilt clustered together, inventing a shared story before the story could invent itself. Those who feared scandal drifted toward corners, eager to be invisible. Those who feared death sat too still, as though movement might invite the lake's attention. Poirot noticed the steward counting passengers twice, his pencil hovering over the same line as though repetition might correct reality. He noticed the captain's officer, a compact man with a stiff jaw, standing near the cabin door, listening with an air of strained patience. He noticed, too, the retired sailor, a broad-shouldered figure leaning near the aft bulkhead, the posture of a man who had watched storms and did not intend to be frightened by one. This sailor, Captain Reed, a retired sea captain traveling as a passenger, had already been mentioned twice in conversation, always as a guarantor of truth. "Ask Captain Reed," someone had said. "He knows water." Captain Reed saw it. Another had insisted. "He says it was an accident," a third had added, with the confidence of borrowed authority. "If Reed says so, it's so." Poirot, who mistrusted authority when it arrived without evidence, decided to speak with him. He chose his moment carefully. Captain Reed, retired, as it turned out, but still addressed with the title by those who needed reassurance, had been answering questions on deck like a man distributing simple medicine. His voice was firm, his explanations neat, his impatience with hysteria pronounced. He seemed, at a glance, exactly what frightened people wanted, certainty shaped like experience. Poirot went to him quietly, allowing the sailor to notice him rather than startling him into defense. Reed did notice. At once, a man who had spent years scanning horizons did not easily ignore movement. "You're the little gentleman who keeps asking," Reed said before Poirot could speak. The tone was not hostile, but it contained a mild resentment, the resentment of someone who believed his account should suffice. "I ask because I listen," Poirot replied pleasantly. "And because the lake has taken a man." Reed's mouth tightened. "The lake takes men. It does not always require a villain." Poirot inclined his head, as though conceding the point. "Sometimes it does not." Reed looked him over more carefully now, noting the neatness, the composure, the deliberate calm. "You're not a policeman." "No," Poirot said, "but I have been useful to them on occasion." That, Poirot knew, was enough to make Reed cautious without making him combative. They stood near the stern where the ferry's wake fanned out in a pale seam of disturbed water. Moonlight lay across it in fragments, trembling with the motion. The air here was colder. The ferry horn sounded again, lower now, not urgent, but heavy with obligation. Somewhere ahead, the far shore waited like a judge. Reed tucked his hands into his coat pockets. His boots were planted wide on the boards, as if he dared the deck to challenge him. "I'll tell you what I told them," he said, jerking his chin toward the scattered passengers. "It was an accident. Simple as that." Poirot smiled faintly. Simple things often prove the most complicated. Reed gave a short laugh. "That sounds like something men say when they can't accept plain facts." Poirot did not disagree. "Tell me what you saw." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he were aligning his memory with a practiced explanation. "I was standing right here, over there, rather." He pointed to a section of rail a dozen paces forward. I came out to smoke. I saw the fellow, Hale they're calling him, standing near the railing. Too close. People do that. They treat railings like furniture. They lean. They forget there's nothing but water beyond. Poirot listened without interruption. The ferry shifted, Reed continued. Not much. You wouldn't feel it unless you've spent time on decks. A slight roll, a slight dip, enough to throw off a man who's careless. He overbalanced, tried to correct. But once your center goes, it goes. Reed spread his hands as if demonstrating inevitability. The tide makes fools of men, he concluded. Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to the lake. There is no tide on a lake, he said mildly. Reed's jaw tightened. Current, then. Same principle, water moves, boats move. Indeed, Poirot agreed. And you are certain the boards were slippery? Reed nodded at once. Always are. Night air, condensation, spray. Poirot glanced down at the deck. The boards were worn. Yes, but they did not shine with moisture. There were patches of damp near the rail where mist had gathered, but not the slick sheen Reed described. Still, Poirot did not correct him immediately. It was more useful to see where a man insisted than where he was wrong. You heard the scream? Poirot asked. Reed shrugged. Someone screamed. People scream when they see someone go over. Poirot tilted his head. But did the scream come before the man vanished or after? Reed hesitated. Very slightly, but Poirot saw it. After, Reed said too quickly. Poirot's tone remained gentle. Others say it came first. Reed's eyes hardened. Others weren't watching, and you were watching. Close enough. Poirot let that phrase sit a moment. Close enough was not the language of a precise witness. It was the language of someone smoothing uncertainty into confidence. I would like, Poirot said, to understand the moment. Will you show me? Reed's lips pressed together. Then he stepped toward the rail, clearly eager to demonstrate. Demonstration, after all, was the easiest way to make a story feel real. He positioned himself at the very spot he had pointed out earlier and leaned his body forward, hands on the rail. He stood like that. Reed said, weight forward. Then the boat shifts, just like. He rocked slightly and dipped his shoulder as if mimicking the ferry's motion. His boots remained planted. His stance did not waver. Poirot watched the boots more than the shoulders. Reed continued, stepping 1 foot forward in an exaggerated misplacement. And then, whoops, he made the motion of slipping. His boots did not slip once. Poirot nodded politely. Interesting, he murmured. Reed straightened, brushing invisible dust from his coat. You see, it's easy. Poirot's gaze remained on the deckboards. Yes, he said softly. But it is not easy to slip on a dry floor. Reed's eyes flicked down. Dry now, not then. Poirot smiled faintly. The smile of a man who acknowledges an excuse without granting it victory. Perhaps. He stepped nearer the rail and placed his own hand lightly upon it, testing the coldness, the faint dampness. There was moisture on the metal, not enough to make hands slide, but enough to mark fingers. Poirot withdrew his hand and examined his glove. A thin sheen remained. Condensation gathers on metal, Poirot remarked. It is obedient. It forms where it forms. Reed shifted again. His shoulders squared as though he had been asked to defend more than a statement. Poirot continued calmly. And when a man falls accidentally, Captain Reed, there is usually a sound, a scrape, a cry, a sharp exhalation, something human. Reed snorted. Sometimes there's nothing. Men go quiet when they're surprised. Sometimes, Poirot agreed. But Mr. Hale feared the water, I am told. Reed's brows drew together. Who told you that? A lady who spoke to him, Poirot replied, watching Reed's face. She says he hated boats. Reed's eyes narrowed. Then why was he on the ferry? Because necessity often defeats fear, Poirot said. But fear leaves habits. A man who fears water grips railings. He keeps distance. He does not lean carelessly forward to admire darkness. Reed opened his mouth, then closed it. His gaze shifted beyond Poirot toward the cabin, as if seeking rescue in activity. Poirot did not press harder yet. He allowed the sailor a small breath of space, then returned with gentle precision. "Captain Reed," he said, "how many years did you serve at sea?" 30, Reed replied sharply. As though the number itself proved authority. "In those 30 years, Poirot continued, how often did you see a man fall overboard while another man was close enough to describe his posture, his weight, his careless leaning? Yet that same witness did not notice whether he cried out." Reed's face reddened slightly. "It happened fast." "Yes," Poirot said. "Fast, and yet you describe it slowly." Reed's eyes flashed. "I know what I saw." Poirot nodded. "You know what you wish to have seen." Reed took a half step forward, then stopped himself. His hands remained in his pockets, but his knuckles strained against the fabric. "Are you accusing me?" he demanded. Poirot shook his head. "Number, I am examining your certainty." Reed let out a harsh breath. "My certainty is all I've got. These fools." He jerked his head toward the passengers clustered in nervous groups. "They'll invent monsters and conspiracies because they can't stand the idea that death can happen without meaning." Poirot's voice softened. "And you cannot stand the idea that meaning might exist." Reed stared at him. For a moment, something like fatigue flickered in his face. An old tiredness, not of the body, but of the mind that has carried responsibility too long. Poirot observed it carefully. Fatigue often loosened truths. They stood in silence. The ferry's wake hissed behind them. The moon emerged from behind a cloud, pale and indifferent. The lake looked calm, too calm. Poirot felt, as he had earlier, that calm could be the most disturbing condition of all, because it offered no clues. Rough water revealed struggle. Smooth water concealed it. "Let us speak of other details," Poirot said at last lightly, as though shifting topics to spare Reed embarrassment. "You said you went out to smoke." Reed nodded. "Do you still have the cigarette?" Reed blinked, thrown off. "What? The cigarette you lit?" Poirot said pleasantly. "It would be natural to drop it." "Yes, in the confusion." Reed's jaw tightened again. "I put it out." "Where?" Reed pointed toward a metal ash container bolted near the bulkhead. Poirot walked to it and looked inside. Several crushed cigarette ends lay there. He did not touch them. He merely noted that one end was damp, as if pressed out recently against moisture, rather than ash. He returned. "You were calm enough to put it out properly," he observed. Reed lifted his chin. "Habit." "Indeed," Poirot agreed. "Habits are powerful." Poirot's gaze drifted again to Reed's boots. Heavy, scuffed, practical. Such boots were not worn for vanity. They were worn because a man expected unstable surfaces. They were designed to grip. "Your boots never slipped when you demonstrated," Poirot said gently. "You made it look like a careless misstep, but your body refused to behave carelessly." Reed's mouth tightened. "That's because I know how to stand." "Exactly," Poirot said. "You know how to stand. You know how to keep balance. And you wish to persuade me that a man who feared water stood as foolishly as a tourist." Reed's eyes flashed again. "Maybe he wasn't afraid." Poirot nodded. "Perhaps. But then the lady who spoke to him is wrong. Or she is remembering what suits her. Or she was told something." Reed's gaze sharpened briefly. "What lady?" Poirot watched him carefully. "Mrs. Hale." Reed's expression changed, only slightly. But it was there. A tightening around the eyes, a faint pull at the corner of the mouth as though he had tasted something unpleasant. "So," Poirot said softly, "you know her." Reed looked away. "Everyone knows everyone on these routes." "That is not an answer," Poirot said, still gentle. "It is a blanket, and blankets are used to cover things." Reed's breath came louder now, visible in the cold air. Poirot continued carefully, as though stepping across thin ice. "Tell me, Captain Reed, were you hired to protect a narrative tonight?" Reed's gaze snapped back. "Hired? By whom?" Poirot shrugged lightly. "I do not yet know, but I know this: your story is neat. It contains no doubt, no confusion, no human error. It is shaped like a report written after the fact, not like a memory, experienced in the moment." Reed's face darkened. "I'm trying to keep people calm." "That," Poirot replied. is admirable, but calm can be manufactured. The sailor stared at him for a long moment. The lake hissed softly behind them, the ferry pushing on through darkness. In the distance, the far shore showed faint points of light. Harbor lamps, perhaps, waiting. Poirot decided then to test one more thing, not Reed's words, but his instincts. "Let us return," Poirot said, "to the moment itself." You say Hale leaned forward. The ferry shifted. He fell. If that is so, Captain Reed, then where did he fall? Reed frowned. "Over the rail." Poirot pointed gently toward the water. "Yes, but in what direction? Straight down or backward as the ferry moved?" Reed hesitated again. Poirot pressed softly. "A body falling from a moving vessel does not drop like a stone. It is carried by momentum. It follows a curve. You, a sailor, know this." Reed's lips parted. His eyes narrowed, calculating. "He would have landed slightly aft," Poirot finished quietly. "Yes, and yet the first shout, according to the steward, came from near the cabin doors. Forward of this point, people ran there. Life buoys were thrown there. Lights were trained there." Reed swallowed. "They looked in the wrong place," Reed said quickly. "Perhaps," Poirot agreed. "Or perhaps they were directed." Reed's shoulders tightened. "I didn't direct anything," Poirot nodded. "Number you offered certainty. Others used it." Reed's gaze dropped. For the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. Not enough to break, but enough to show strain. He looked suddenly older. Poirot softened his tone further. "Captain Reed, I do not think you are a murderer." Reed's head snapped up. "Then what do you think?" Poirot regarded him with quiet sympathy. "I think you are a man who has spent his life believing that accidents happen, and perhaps you have spent your life being blamed for them. You do not want this to become something worse, because something worse would mean that the world is not merely dangerous. It is designed to be." Your Reed's jaw worked. He looked away again, toward the black water. Poirot continued. "But truth does not care what we want. It cares only for what is." A pause. Then Reed spoke, his voice lower, rougher. "You're not wrong about one thing." Poirot remained still. "Which thing?" Reed swallowed. "The scream." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Yes?" Reed stared at the lake, not at Poirot. "It came first." Poirot nodded slowly, as though confirming a piece already placed. "Thank you." Reed's shoulders slumped slightly. "I didn't want." He stopped. Poirot waited patient. Reed shook his head hard, as if trying to dislodge the thought. "People panic. They trample each other. Someone could have been hurt. I tried to stop it." "So you gave them an accident," Poirot said gently. "A simple story, a safe story." Reed's voice was tight. "Is that a crime?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the cabin windows where silhouettes moved, passengers still speaking, still arguing, still clinging to certainty like a life ring. "It depends," Poirot said at last, "on what the safe story is protecting." Reed met his gaze then, fully at last. In his eyes was something that had not been there before. Not defiance, but reluctant respect, and perhaps even fear. "You think he didn't fall," Reed said quietly. Poirot's voice remained calm. "I think he vanished." Reed's breath caught. "What's the difference?" Poirot looked out over the water, smooth and dark. "A fall is an event, a vanishing is a design." Reed's mouth tightened. He seemed to weigh words, as if choosing the least dangerous. "The lights, people running." Poirot leaned in slightly. "Did you see the moment he left the deck?" Reed hesitated. "Not clearly." Poirot nodded. "That is more honest." Reed's voice turned defensive again, but weaker. "It happened fast." "Yes," Poirot said, "and that is precisely why your earlier story was too neat." Reed's gaze dropped once more, ashamed perhaps, not of what he had said, but of why he had said it. Poirot stepped back, letting air return between them. He did not wish to corner the sailor. Cornered men either fight or lie more desperately. Poirot preferred men to loosen their truths on their own. "Captain Reed," he said gently, Who spoke to you first after the scream? Reed blinked. What? Who came to you? Poirot repeated, and asked. What happened? Reed's eyes flicked toward the cabin door. That officer, the captain's man, he asked if I saw. And you answered. Your Reed's jaw tightened. I said what I thought would calm people. Poirot nodded. And did anyone else speak to you? Reed hesitated. His eyes shifted again. Not toward the cabin now, but toward the far end of the deck, where shadows gathered near the lifeboat housing. Poirot followed the glance without turning his head too sharply. A thin man stood there. Clothes, cropped hair, hands in pockets, posture deliberately casual. He had been quiet all night, and his silence had not been the silence of shock. It had been the silence of calculation. Poirot returned his attention to Reed. Summon, he said softly. Did not want the ferry to turn back. Reed's throat worked. They couldn't, he muttered. Captain said. Poirot's voice was very mild. Captains can turn back when they wish. What they cannot do is turn back without consequence. Someone wanted the consequence to be too great. Reed stared at him, then looked away. He did not answer, but his silence had changed. It was not the stubborn silence of certainty. It was the reluctant silence of a man who knew he had been used. Poirot inclined his head politely. Thank you, Captain Reed. You have been most helpful. You're Reed. Let out a harsh breath. Helpful. I've done nothing but talk. Poirot smiled faintly. Talking reveals more than doing sometimes. He turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. One more question. Reed's shoulders sagged. Go on. Poirot pointed gently to Reed's boots. Where did you buy them? Reed frowned, bewildered. What? Those boots, Poirot said. They are not ordinary deck boots. They have a particular sole, excellent grip, excellent stability. Reed's expression tightened. Outfitter in town. Why? Poirot nodded as though satisfied. Because a man who wears boots like that does not slip by accident. Reed stared at him. Poirot added gently, unless he wishes to persuade someone else that slipping is possible. Reed's face flushed, but he did not protest. He only looked away toward the calm, dark water. Poirot walked back toward the cabin, his mind quietly ordering itself. Captain Reed had not murdered anyone. Poirot did not believe that. But Reed had offered certainty with the speed of a man desperate to prevent chaos. That certainty had been accepted eagerly, because it was comfortable. Comfort, Poirot knew, was the most dangerous thing in an investigation. It allowed lies to put on clean clothes and walk among people unnoticed. The water below remained disturbingly calm. Poirot paused at the cabin door and looked back once, watching Reed's rigid silhouette against the rail. The sailor stood very still now, as if the ferry's boards had become less trustworthy beneath him. Poirot's eyes drifted again to the thin man near the lifeboats, still silent, still observing. Then he stepped inside, into the harsh light and the crowded air, where passengers argued intent while denying offense, and where every voice carried certainty like a shield. Poirot's own certainty was of a different kind. Something had been arranged tonight, not merely a fall, but confusion, not merely loss, but contradiction. And when a story is too neat, Poirot reflected, it is usually because someone has pressed it into shape with careful hands. Soon, he decided, he would find those hands. Chapter 5. The musician's silence after his conversation with Captain Reed. Poirot returned to the cabin with the sensation that the air had thickened, not with fog, as it had at the beginning of the crossing, but with stories. Each passenger carried one now. Some held theirs like a shield, others like a lantern. A few clutched theirs like a weapon they dared no one to touch. The ferry moved on through the night, committed to its course. The far shore was still distant, its lights faint and unwavering. Between here and there lay black water and the time in which panic could harden into certainty and certainty could become a lie that everyone agreed to remember. Poirot did not hurry. He moved as though he had all the time in the world, which was precisely the manner most likely to draw people into revealing that they did not. He found the violinist in the narrow corridor beside the small lounge an awkward in-between space, where coats were hung and suitcases were stacked. She had positioned herself near a porthole, like window, half concealed by a curtain that trembled faintly with the ferry's motion. She was seated on a bench that ran along the wall, hands folded in her lap, shoulders very straight. Her violin case rested at her feet, closed and latched, as though even its contents might not be trusted to remain safe in the open. She could not have been more than 22. Her face was pale, delicately formed, with the kind of calm that comes either from discipline or from having learned early not to show fear. Her dark hair was gathered into a low knot that was both neat and slightly undone, as though it had been arranged quickly and then forgotten. She wore a simple wool coat and gloves that she had not removed. Despite being indoors, Poirot approached without announcing himself. He stood just close enough for her to become aware of him in the corner of her vision, and then he waited. He had learned that people often spoke more freely when they believed the first word was theirs. At last she lifted her eyes. "You are the gentleman who has been asking questions," she said quietly. "Yes," Poirot replied. "And you are the young lady who has not been answering them." A faint tension passed through her jaw. It was slight, but he saw it. "My name is Celia Marlowe," she said after a moment. "I play at the Winter Hall in the city. I was returning after a rehearsal." Poirot inclined his head. "A musician, that explains much." She blinked, uncertain. "Explains what?" "The discipline," Poirot said gently. "The control, and perhaps the silence." Her gaze dropped briefly to her gloved hands. Silence is sometimes the only thing one can control. Poirot's eyes softened. He moved a fraction closer, careful not to crowd her. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "I am told that you said something to the steward earlier." Her face remained composed, but her eyes sharpened. "What did I say?" For the first time, her composure wavered. Not in a dramatic way, but in the small human way that mattered most. Her breathing changed, quickening slightly, then settling as she forced it back into steadiness. "I did say that," she admitted. Poirot nodded. "Then you understand why I have come." She looked toward the window, where the lake slid past like ink. "You think I know something?" "I think," Poirot corrected softly, "that you have chosen not to say something." Her lips pressed together. The bench creaked faintly as the ferry shifted. "You were on deck," Poirot said. "Yes." "Where?" "Near the port side, closer to the stern," she replied. "I prefer to stand away from crowds. The air is clearer." "And when the scream happened?" "I was already watching the water," she said. "Not because I expected anything. I simply watch reflections. It is a habit." Poirot's eyes brightened slightly. "Reflections?" "Yes." The word carried weight for him. Reflections changed with movement. They revealed angles that direct sight could miss. They could disguise or disclose. Many crimes were committed by those who believed they stood in darkness, forgetting that darkness still reflected light. Celia's voice was careful now, as though each sentence were a note she had rehearsed, but did not fully trust. "The scream came from nearer the cabin," she said. "A woman, the one in the pale coat." She cried out sharply, like she had been startled. Poirot nodded. "And the glass?" "I heard the shatter," Celia said, "but it was muffled. The wind carried it away. The engines were loud too." "You heard nothing else?" Poirot prompted. She shook her head. "Not clearly. People think sound travels cleanly on water, but it does not. It breaks. It gets swallowed by the boat." Poirot smiled faintly. "An excellent observation. Many people believe they hear what they only assume." Celia's gaze lifted to him again. "I did not assume," she said quietly. "I watched." Poirot let a small silence pass, inviting her to continue. "I saw Mr. Hale," she said. "Before anyone shouted his name, he was at the railing, a little forward from where Captain Reed said he was." Poirot's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. Forward, not aft, not where the neat story had placed him. "How do you know it was Mr. Hale?" Poirot asked gently. Celia hesitated. then nodded toward the corridor behind Poirot. The steward showed us a description, but also I had noticed him earlier. He carried papers, a ledger. He looked like someone who kept his life in columns. Poirot allowed himself a small approving nod. It was a very Poirot-like description, and he respected her for it. "Tell me what you saw," Poirot said, slowly. Celia drew a breath. Her hands tightened in her lap, then relaxed, as though she were forcing herself not to twist them. She had the musician's instinct to keep her fingers ready, unshaken. "He stood at the railing," she said, "but not as someone admiring the view. His shoulders were stiff. He kept glancing over his left shoulder toward the cabin doors." Poirot stored this carefully. Left shoulder, a habit of watching a particular approach. "Then," Celia continued, "he did something strange. He moved backward." "Backward," Poirot repeated softly. "Yes, slowly, as if he wanted to create distance without turning his back. It was cautious, controlled." Poirot's eyes sharpened, like a man retreating from another man. Celia nodded once, his mouth moved. He spoke, I think, but no sound reached me. "Wind," Poirot suggested. "Wind," Celia agreed, and the engines, and the way people were laughing nearby. Not loudly, but enough to blur. I saw his lips. I saw the tension in his jaw. I could tell he was speaking. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Intent. Did he seem angry? Celia considered. Number not angry, more like. She searched for the word, measured, like someone trying not to provoke. Poirot felt the shape of it immediately. A man negotiating in fear, a man weighing his words. "And then," Poirot asked, Celia's throat worked. She glanced down at her violin case, then back up. Then I saw another hand. Poirot did not react outwardly. He merely waited, giving the statement room to become undeniable. "A hand," Poirot said quietly. "Where?" "On the railing," Celia replied, "near Mr. Hale's right side." Poirot's voice remained gentle, but there was an iron clarity in it now. "Not Mr. Hale's hand." "No," Celia said. "He was gripping the rail with both hands. I saw that. This hand was different. It appeared beside his." Poirot's mind moved swiftly. A second person close enough to touch the rail beside Hale, yet unnoticed by those who spoke so loudly of what they knew. "Describe it," Poirot said. Celia's eyes narrowed slightly, the expression of someone visualizing a detail with precision. "It was a man's hand," she said. "Large, bare, no glove, like someone who had removed it to smoke." Poirot's gaze flicked to her own gloves. "You are certain it was bare?" "Yes," she said firmly. The skin caught the light. I saw the knuckles clearly. Poirot nodded. "And did you see the arm, the sleeve?" "Yes, a dark sleeve. A coat, I think. But there was a sleeve edge, neat against the wrist, and something metallic that caught the light." "A man dressed with care," Poirot murmured. Celia swallowed. "Maybe." Poirot turned slightly, as though considering the corridor beyond. Several men aboard wore dark coats. Several had shown neat cuffs, yet only one detail mattered, where that hand had been, and what it did. "What did the hand do?" Poirot asked. Celia's voice lowered. "It did not grab him, not like in the stories people tell. It pressed," Poirot repeated. "Yes," Celia said. "Not a shove, not sudden, more like guidance, like someone encouraging him to move, one way." Poirot felt an unpleasant satisfaction. This matched what he had suspected from the beginning, a disappearance engineered to produce confusion, not a crude struggle. "And Mr. Hale?" Poirot asked. Celia's eyes glistened faintly, though her voice remained controlled. He backed away further. His mouth moved faster. He looked. She paused. He looked as though he was trying to keep his fear inside his chest. Poirot's gaze softened for a moment. And then... "The scream happened," Celia said. "The woman near the cabin," she cried out. "People turned their heads, and in that instant, Celia's fingers tightened. Mr. Hale was gone. Poirot waited. He did not topple. Celia said firmly, as though correcting a false memory. He did not flail. I did not see him fall like a drunk man. He simply vanished downward, dropping out of sight into the narrow maintenance access below the rail, where a man could reach the lower walkway before anyone thought to look down. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Downward, not outward. Celia nodded quickly. Yes, like a trapdoor opened, but there is no trapdoor, is there? Poirot did not answer. He was thinking of ferry design, of access points, of gaps between railing and structure, of service stairwells and doors that might open onto darkness. He was thinking, too, of the missing leather case. A man could vanish without falling if he were pulled, if he stepped, if he was guided into an opening that had been prepared. Miss Marlowe, Poirot said gently, why did you not tell this earlier? Celia's jaw tightened. She stared at the floorboards for a moment, as though reading a score that only she could see. Because, she said quietly, the moment I spoke, I realized everyone wanted an accident. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Wanted? Yes, Celia said, her voice suddenly sharper. They kept saying it was a slip, a drunk man, a foolish step. They repeated it like a tune they had learned. And she drew a breath. I have spent my life among people who repeat what comforts them. In music, repetition makes something beautiful. In truth, it makes something false. Poirot regarded her with appreciation. Very well said. Celia's eyes lifted to his, and also because I was afraid. Of what? Poirot asked gently. Celia hesitated, then spoke with reluctant honesty. Of being noticed. Poirot nodded slowly. You believe the person with the hand might still be on the ferry? Celia's silence was answer enough. Poirot took a seat on the opposite bench, not as an equal in confession, but as a man making space for courage. Miss Marlowe, he said softly, truth hides in what is unsaid, but it cannot remain there forever. Celia's fingers flexed once, as though preparing to play. You asked me earlier why I watch reflections, she said. Yes. She looked toward the window, where moonlight trembled across the water. When I was a child, my teacher told me that you can learn more from a reflection than from a face. A face performs. A reflection cannot choose its expression. Poirot smiled faintly. Your teacher was wise. Celia nodded, then continued. I was watching the water because it steadies me, the pattern of light, the repetition. And that is how I saw the hand, because it was reflected before it was visible. Poirot's posture became very still. Reflected, he repeated. Yes, Celia said, in the glass of the cabin door, behind Mr. Hale. The door has a window panel. The moon caught it, and I saw, briefly, the shape of someone close to him before I saw the person directly. Poirot's mind clicked into a new configuration. A reflection in glass could reveal a position that direct sight might miss. It could also reveal the direction from which someone approached. From which side? Poirot asked quietly. Celia did not hesitate. From, behind him, from the cabin side. Not from the stern. Poirot thought again of Captain Reed's neat demonstration, placing Hale near the stern, with a convenient slip and a convenient current. Too neat. And now, the approach from the cabin side. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Then Captain Reed did not see the approach. I don't know what he saw, Celia said, but I know what I saw. Poirot nodded. Good. He leaned forward slightly. Now, one question remains, and it is the most important. You said you saw another hand on the railing. Yes. Which hand, Miss Marlowe? Poirot asked, his voice gentle, but exact. Left or right? Celia's gaze drifted toward the door, as though she could see the scene again, perfectly lit in her mind. Then she raised her own hand and pointed, not to her left or right, but toward a precise space in the air, matching the angle of the railing relative to her position. It was the left hand, she said without hesitation. The thumb faced inward toward Mr. Hale. Poirot's eyes brightened with that quiet intensity that often preceded a decisive turn in his thinking. A left hand meant something about the position of the person standing beside Hale, about the side from which they approached, about what part of their body would have been visible to others, and what part hidden. And the cuff, Poirot asked softly. What did you notice? It was clean, Celia replied. White. And there was something at the wrist. A watch, Poirot suggested. Celia nodded slowly. Yes, the metal caught the moonlight for a moment, just a glint. Poirot felt the case tighten into shape. A bare left hand, a neat cuff, a watch that glinted. This was not a dockworker's hand, not a sailor's, not a steward's. It belonged to someone who dressed well and who believed they could keep their hands clean even while guiding another man into darkness. Poirot stood. You have done very well, he said gently. Celia's composure finally cracked in the smallest way. Her eyes filled and she blinked hard, refusing tears. Will you tell them? She asked. Will you tell everyone what I said? Poirot's voice was calm. Not yet. Her face tightened. Why not? Because, Poirot replied, the moment your testimony becomes public, the person with the watch will know exactly what you saw, and they may decide that you are too dangerous to remain unharmed. Celia went very still. Poirot softened his tone. Do not be afraid. I will not leave you without protection, but we must be careful. She swallowed. Then what do I do? For now, Poirot said, you remain exactly where you are expected to be, a quiet young woman who says nothing and keeps to herself. Celia gave a small, bitter laugh. That will not be difficult. Poirot inclined his head. Good, and one more thing. Yes, Poirot's eyes met hers steadily. Can you identify the person who owned that hand? Celia hesitated. Number. I did not see the face clearly, only the sleeve, the cuff, the hand. Poirot nodded, satisfied. That is enough. Faces lie more easily than hands. He moved toward the corridor door, then paused. Miss Marlowe, he said softly, you said you heard nothing. Yes, but you saw Mr. Hale's mouth move, Poirot continued. Do you read lips? Celia blinked, surprised. A little musicians watch conductors. We learn to read cues. Poirot's voice was very gentle. Then tell me, what words did you think he was saying? Celia's brow furrowed as she reached back into memory. He said something like, please, don't. And then she swallowed. And then I think he said, I don't have it. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You are not sure? No, Celia admitted. It was too quick, the angle. Poirot nodded. But the idea is clear. I don't have it. The missing case, the papers, the permits. Something valuable enough to make a man vanish and to make a story too neat appear immediately afterward. Poirot smiled faintly. Thank you, he said. He stepped out into the cabin where passengers still murmured and argued, their certainty growing louder as time passed. Poirot moved through them with quiet purpose, his mind now armed with the most dangerous thing on the ferry, a detail that could not be conveniently explained away. A bare left hand, a clean cuff, a watch that glinted in moonlight, a man backing away, speaking without sound, and a vanishing downward, not outward, as though the ferry itself had briefly opened its mouth. Poirot glanced toward the far end of the cabin where the captain's officer stood. The man's cuff was visible beneath his sleeve, neat, white, controlled. Poirot did not jump to conclusions. He merely noted. He glanced toward the thin man near the lifeboats when the door swung open and a cold gust entered. The man's coat sleeve rode up slightly as he adjusted his collar. Poirot's eyes sharpened. A cuff, something metallic at the wrist. Poirot did not stare. He did not react. He simply let the observation settle into place, like the final note of a phrase. Truth, he reflected, was not always shouted. Often it was played softly by those who had trained themselves to listen. And on this ferry, in the midst of noise and certainty, the musician's silence had become the clearest sound of all. Chapter 6. The broken reflection. The ferry seemed smaller after midnight. Not in measurement, of course, but in feeling, in the way panic had tightened the available air and turned every corridor into a funnel for rumor. People had returned to their seats and their corners, but they did not return to themselves. Faces were too alert. Hands moved too often. Even those who attempted calm performed it with a stiffness that betrayed the effort. The lake outside remained distressingly composed. The wake trailed behind like a pale scar, slowly closing. Moonlight came and went beneath passing clouds, and each time it returned it seemed to illuminate not the water, but the agitation aboard. Poirot moved through the cabin with the deliberate patience of a man collecting not facts, but impressions. How voices rose when names were mentioned. How quickly blame was offered and then withdrawn. How certain phrases repeated with unnatural uniformity. He heard, again and again, the same comforting narrative, being pressed into shape. Slippery boards, a careless step, an accident. Nothing to be done. Captain Reed's certainty had been handed from mouth to mouth, like a warm cup on a cold night. And yet beneath that repeated reassurance, Poirot felt an undertow of unease. People did not truly believe their own words. They merely needed to. He paused near the cabin doors and looked out onto the deck, the spot where the disturbance had begun, where voices had converged, where arms had pointed, where flashlights had swept the surface, was now marked only by a few scuff marks and one overturned chair that no one had bothered to right. Its neglect seemed symbolic. The human mind, Poirot reflected, tidied what it wished to keep and ignored what it could not endure. He thought of Celia Marlowe's quiet precision, of the bare left hand on the rail, of the glint of a watch, of the words he believed Marcus Hale had shaped without sound. I don't have it. One might have pursued the obvious next step, searching sleeves, examining wrists, demanding to see watches like a customs officer. But Poirot did not do this. Not yet. A direct challenge would only drive a clever person into deeper concealment. And on a ferry, concealment had many easy forms. A coat turned inside out, a hand tucked into a pocket, a watch removed and swallowed by the dark. Number first, he needed something stronger than suspicion. He needed structure. He needed to break the story that everyone was repeating, and to replace it with one no one could comfortably inhabit. Poirot approached the captain's officer, the compact man with the stiff jaw, who stood near the door, as though guarding it from the passengers rather than the passengers from it. "Sir," Poirot said politely, "I will require a small cooperation." The officer looked down at him with weary irritation. "We've already cooperated. The captain has sent for the lake patrol. We are proceeding as safely as we can." "Excellent," Poirot replied. "Now I ask something different. I ask for 5 minutes of your time and 10 minutes of your passengers' honesty." The officer frowned. "Honesty?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, it is less common than obedience, but more useful. I can't force people to." "You do not need to force them," Poirot said gently. "You need only ask them to stand where they stood." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Poirot's tone remained courteous, but his words carried quiet certainty. "Because the ferry is still moving. The moon is still above us. The water is still the same water, and the human eye is still very easily deceived." Something in Poirot's manner, calm, assured, unembarrassed, made the officer hesitate. He glanced toward the captain's door, then back. "All right," he said grudgingly. 5 minutes. "Thank you," Poirot replied. Within moments, the officer raised his voice and called for attention. It was not a shout, but it carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Passengers looked up, irritated, nervous, curious. They did not like to be gathered. It suggested responsibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officer announced, "Mr. Poirot requests that you come onto the deck. Those who were near the incident should attend. Please comply." There was a murmur of protest. A few people pretended not to hear, but the officer repeated the request with an edge that discouraged defiance, and gradually bodies rose. Coats were tightened, scarves adjusted. They spilled out onto the deck in a reluctant stream. The night air struck them immediately, cold and clean. It cleared the cabin's stale tension and replaced it with the sharper discomfort of exposure. Under the ferry lights, Faces looked paler, eyes brighter. The deckboards felt firmer than memories insisted they had been. Poirot stood near the rail slightly forward of the cluster, positioned so that he could see both the passengers and the water beyond. He waited until most had gathered. Captain Reed, unmistakable in his heavy boots and stubborn posture. The scarfed man who had claimed Hale argued loudly. The older man with spectacles who insisted Hale never spoke. The woman who had described Hale's fear of water, Eleanor Hale, composed and trembling beneath her shawl. A few additional passengers, whose faces Poirot recognized as frequent onlookers, and standing slightly apart, Celia Marlowe, quiet as ever, her violin case still at her feet. Poirot noted who stood where. More importantly, he noted who chose to stand near the edges, ready to step away if attention turned too sharply. The thin man near the lifeboats was there too. He lingered at the boundary of the group, hands in pockets, chin slightly lowered, eyes scanning not the water, but the people. He did not look like a man in grief or shock. He looked like a man watching a performance from the wings, prepared to exit if the script changed. Poirot pretended not to notice him. For now. Thank you, Poirot said to the assembled passengers. His voice was not loud, but it carried, clear, composed, and oddly comforting in its certainty. I will not keep you long. I ask only for your memory and your willingness to stand again where you stood. A few people exchanged glances. The scarfed man scoffed under his breath. Captain Reed folded his arms. Poirot continued gently. We have many accounts. Some say Mr. Hale argued loudly. Some say he was silent. Some say he was drunk. Some say he feared water. Some say he fell accidentally. Some Poirot's gaze flicked very briefly toward Celia, say he did not fall as an accident at all. A ripple of unease went through the group. Several people shifted their feet. Poirot raised a hand, not to silence them harshly, but to steady them. You are all certain. That is natural. Certainty feels like safety, but certainty can also be a shelter built from fear. Captain Reed snorted. Are we doing this again? The man's gone. That's the truth. Poirot inclined his head politely. Yes, Captain Reed. The man is gone. The question is how. Reed's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Poirot turned his gaze outward toward the water. The moon had emerged again, pale and fractured by a band of cloud. Its reflection lay across the lake like a broken coin, trembling with the ferry's motion. Please, Poirot said. All of you face the water. They did, reluctantly. A line of bodies turned toward the black surface. The ferry lights behind them cast their shadows forward, long, overlapping shapes that stretched across the deckboards toward the rail. Poirot watched the shadows carefully. Now, he said, tell me where you stood. There was hesitation. People looked at one another, uncertain whether to speak first. Poirot waited. Patient silence, he knew, was not empty. It was crowded with calculation. The scarfed man spoke first, eager as always to claim narrative territory. I was near the cabin doors, right there. He moved, planting himself near the doorframe, as though marking a stake. Poirot nodded. Good. And you, monsieur? He asked the older man with spectacles. I was on the bench near the life ring, the man replied, moving stiffly to his chosen spot. Poirot nodded again. Madam, he asked the woman who had said Hale feared water. Near the railing, but not close, she said. I was walking. I came toward the center. Poirot watched her feet. She chose a position that placed her neither too near the rail nor too near the cabin. A safe middle, a memory shaped by caution. And Mrs. Hale? Poirot asked gently. Eleanor Hale's hands tightened around her shawl. She stepped forward a little, then stopped, as though the deck itself resisted her. I was near the cabin window, she said quietly. I came out, and I saw Marcus. Poirot nodded, saying nothing. And you, Captain Reed? Poirot asked. Reed moved with heavy certainty, placing himself near the stern rail. Here, like I told you. Poirot observed how Reed's shadow fell, broad, stable, unbroken. Celia remained where she was, slightly apart. Poirot looked at her. "Miss Marlowe?" She moved without hesitation to a spot near the port side, closer to the stern than the others, but not as far back as Reed. She stood with her shoulders straight, her gaze fixed on the water, as though she were about to perform. Poirot took all this in. Then he smiled faintly. "You see," he said softly, "already we have a difficulty." The scarfed man frowned. "What difficulty? We're standing." "Yes," Poirot replied. "You are standing, but your shadows. Look at them." He gestured downward. They looked. Under the ferry lights, the shadows stretched toward the rail in a tangled pattern. Some overlapped in ways that did not match the claimed positions. Reed's shadow, for example, lay across the space where the older man insisted he had been seated. The scarfed man's shadow, cast from the cabin lights, fell at an angle that would have placed him more central than he claimed. Eleanor's shadow did not reach the rail at all, suggesting she was closer to the cabin than she had described. A murmur rose again. Poirot lifted his hand. "No, no, do not be offended. Shadows are only the first lesson. They tell us something very simple. On this deck, at night, you cannot see clearly who stands where. Your own bodies interfere with your sight. Your own fear interferes with your memory." Captain Reed scoffed. "That's nonsense. I saw him." Poirot turned to him calmly. "Did you, Captain Reed? Or did you see what your mind expected?" Reed's eyes flashed, but he did not answer. Poirot continued, voice mild. "Now, let us place Mr. Hale." A hush fell. Poirot stepped forward and indicated a point near the railing, slightly forward of the center. "According to several accounts, he stood here. Some say near the stern, some say near the cabin, but we will choose a compromise point, and we will adjust until the contradictions reveal themselves." The scarfed man shook his head. He was right there near the cabin doors, arguing. The older man snapped. He was on the bench, quiet. Poirot nodded pleasantly. "Yes, and you are both certain." He looked at Celia. "Miss Marlowe, would you stand where you saw him?" Celia moved a few steps forward and placed herself at a point slightly forward of Poirot's indicated spot. She did it with the calm precision of someone setting a music stand. "Here," she said quietly. Poirot nodded. "Very good." Eleanor Hale's breath caught, but she said nothing. Poirot turned to the group. "Now," he said, "I ask you to do something uncomfortable. I ask you to admit that you did not see what you think you saw." A protest began, but Poirot continued smoothly before it could swell. "On this ferry," he said, "there is light, there is darkness, there is motion, there is wind. The human brain, confronted with uncertainty, fills the gap. It supplies a story. That story feels like sight, but it is not sight. It is interpretation." He walked toward the cabin doors. "Observe these windows," he said, indicating the rectangular glass panel set into one of the doors. "In daylight, you see through them. At night, with lights inside and darkness outside, they become mirrors." Several passengers glanced at the glass. Under the bright cabin lights, their faces reflected faintly, ghost-like. Poirot looked at Celia. "You said you watched reflections." Celia nodded. Poirot turned back to the group. "Then you understand. The glass here does not show the lake. It shows you." He moved to the rail again and gestured toward the water. "And the lake, too, reflects. The moon reflects. The ferry lights reflect. When you look at the surface, you see not only what is there, but what is above it." He paused, letting the words settle. "Tell me," Poirot said, "when the scream occurred, how many of you looked directly at Mr. Hale's face?" No one answered. "How many of you looked directly at his feet?" Poirot continued. Still no answer. "How many of you looked at the water?" A few nodded, uncertainly. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes. Most of you looked at the water because you thought the story was already written. A man in water, so you searched for water. But the important thing, mesdames and messieurs, is what happened before he met the water." He stepped closer to the rail and placed his gloved hand lightly on it. "If a man falls accidentally, He goes outward. His center of gravity tips. His arms flail. He strikes the rail, perhaps. There is sound. There is movement that draws the eye. Captain Reed's jaw tightened, but Poirot continued. If a man is guided, if he is persuaded, threatened, or maneuvered, he may go downward. He may disappear from your sight not because he fell like a stone, but because he stepped into a place you did not know existed. The group stirred. The scarfed man scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction now. Poirot turned, scanning faces. You are uneasy because you are imagining trapdoors, but I did not say trapdoors. I said places you did not know existed. He walked a few steps along the deck, toward a section where the ferry's structure rose slightly. An access panel, a service hatch, a narrow gap between a railing post, and a small maintenance stair leading down to a lower walkway. It was not obvious to the casual eye, especially at night, especially in panic. Poirot stopped there. He did not touch it yet. He merely stood beside it, allowing the shape of it to become visible. Captain Reed, Poirot said gently, you demonstrated a slip. But you used your whole body. You made a performance. A slip, in truth, is small. It is not dramatic. It is a foot finding emptiness where wood should be. Reed bristled. I told you, the boards were slick. Poirot nodded. Perhaps, but a slick board does not explain a vanishing downward. He looked at the older man with spectacles. You insist Mr. Hale did not speak. The man stiffened. Aye. He sat quietly. Poirot smiled. You sat quietly, monsieur. Your mind gave the quiet to him. It happens. The older man flushed, offended. Poirot turned to the scarfed man. And you insist, he argued loudly. Yes, the man said stubbornly. Poirot's gaze sharpened. With whom? The scarfed man hesitated. A fellow grey coat. Poirot nodded. A grey coat. How convenient many men wear grey coats. An argument with a grey coat can be blamed on anyone. The scarfed man's face reddened. I know what I heard. Poirot's tone remained mild. Do you, or did you hear a voice raised and assign it to the most dramatic person in your imagination? The man opened his mouth, then shut it. Poirot turned to Eleanor Hale. His voice softened. Mrs. Hale, you described a shadow behind your husband. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her shawl. Yes. Poirot nodded. And no one else recalls that shadow. Eleanor's eyes glistened. They weren't watching. Poirot's voice was gentle. Or they were watching, but not seeing. Or they saw a reflection and mistook it for a figure. Eleanor flinched slightly, as if struck by the idea. Poirot allowed her a moment, then continued. Now, he said, we will do something more precise. He turned to the group again. I will ask you each to look at the water, not with your eyes, but with your minds. The moon's reflection is there. It trembles, it breaks, it changes. Now I ask you, when you saw a figure near the rail, did you see it directly? Or did you see it in the water first? A silence. Celia's voice, quiet but clear, cut through it. In the glass first, she said. Then in the water. Poirot nodded. Yes. And the water reflects left and right reversed. Does it not? Several people frowned, not understanding. Poirot smiled faintly. A mirror reverses. When you look at a reflection, your right becomes left, your left becomes right. And when you are frightened, you do not correct for this. You simply accept. He gestured toward the lake. If you saw a hand in reflection, you may swear it was on the right when it was on the left. If you saw a figure approach from behind, you may swear it came from the other side. And if you saw a man vanish downward near a gap, you may swear he fell outward into the water, because your mind prefers the familiar tragedy to the unfamiliar mechanism. A collective unease settled in. People shifted their weight. Faces tightened. They did not like being told their minds were unreliable. It felt like an insult, even when it was a fact. Poirot's voice remained gentle. You saw truth, he said, but only its mirror. He turned toward the cabin door again and pointed at the glass panel. Look at yourselves. Reluctantly they did. Under the cabin lights, their reflections stared back, paler, distorted by the slight curvature and smudges on the glass. A woman's face overlapped a man's shoulder. A hat brim seemed to cut through another's cheek. The images were fractured like broken glass. Poirot spoke softly. Now imagine this panel in the moment of panic. The scream, the shifting bodies, the sudden turning of heads. A reflection becomes a person becomes a shadow. A hand becomes a push becomes a slip. Captain Reed's face darkened. So what are you saying? None of us saw anything. Poirot shook his head. Number, I say you all saw something, but you saw it differently, and the difference is, those are the truth. He moved back toward the rail, toward the subtle gap near the maintenance stair. He crouched slightly and examined the deck boards and the base of the railing post. Under the glare of the ferry lights, he could see faint marks, a scuff that ran at an angle, as if a shoe had slid not forward, but sideways, a smear on the post oil or skin perhaps. The sea did not leave such marks, people did. Poirot stood. Captain Reed, he said, your certainty was offered as comfort, but comfort is dangerous. It allows the guilty to hide among the reassured. Reed's jaw tightened, but his eyes flicked away. Poirot turned to the officer. Is there an access to the lower maintenance walkway from this section? The officer blinked, startled. Yes, there's a small stair crew only. Poirot nodded. And is the gate always secured? The officer hesitated. It should be. Poirot's smile was faint, polite, and sharp. Should be is not always is. A ripple of alarm moved through the group. Several people stepped back slightly from the rail, suddenly aware of the ferry structure in a way they had not been before. Poirot continued calmly. If Mr. Hale stepped, was guided, into that access point, he would vanish from your sight. In the confusion, you would assume he fell overboard. You would rush to the water. You would look outward, not downward. And by the time anyone thought to look elsewhere, Poirot spread his hands gently. The ferry would be moving forward, unable to turn back. Eleanor Hale swayed slightly. Poirot watched her carefully. So he might still be on the ferry, someone whispered. Poirot's eyes remained calm. Or he might have been on it longer than you think. Celia's face tightened. She glanced toward the far end of the deck, where the thin man still lingered near the lifeboats. Poirot noticed the glance. Poirot turned again to the group. I do not yet tell you what happened, he said. I tell you only that what you saw was not what occurred. He paused, letting the words land with full weight. The moon's reflection, Poirot continued softly, was the key. It fractured, it reversed. It made you all witnesses to a mirror, not to a moment. Captain Reed's voice came out rougher than before. And what now? Poirot's expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened with intent. Now, he said, I ask the crew to check every access point below deck. I ask that no one leaves their sight. I ask that we find the missing leather case, and I ask that those who offered certainty too quickly. His gaze drifted briefly over Reed, the scarfed man, and then, almost imperceptibly, toward the thin man, prepare to discover that certainty does not protect them. A heavier silence followed. The lake below remained calm, but now it looked less like an accomplice and more like a warning, an indifferent surface hiding depths that did not care what stories people told about them. Poirot turned his face toward the water once more. The moon emerged from behind cloud, fractured and cold. Its reflection trembled in broken stripes, reversing and distorting as the ferry moved. You saw truth, Poirot murmured again, almost to himself, but only its mirror. Then he stepped away from the rail and began, quietly and decisively, to search for the truth beneath the deck, where reflections could not reverse it, and where silence could no longer pretend to be innocence. Chapter 7. The hidden motive. The ferry's lower levels were colder than the deck. Down there, the air carried a different smell. Metal, fuel, damp rope, and the faint sourness of water that had seeped into places it was never meant to reach. Pipes ran along the ceiling like veins. bulkheads narrowed corridors into tight passages where a body could not turn quickly. The ferry's steady vibration felt more intimate here, less like a distant engine and more like something alive that pulsed beneath one's feet. Poirot had asked the captain's officer for a discreet search, and it had been granted with reluctant urgency, not because the officer believed Poirot's reasoning, but because the possibility that a missing man might still be aboard was too dangerous to ignore. Procedures changed the moment danger became practical. A crewman led Poirot down the maintenance stair he had indicated on deck, the one most passengers had never noticed. The gate at its top should have been locked. It had not been. The latch hung slightly loose, as though recently opened and then closed without care. Poirot did not touch it. He merely observed, storing the detail, like a small stone in the pocket of his mind. Below, the narrow walkway ran along the ferry's side, bordered by pipes and storage compartments. A faint trail of moisture darkened the metal floor near the bottom step. Not enough to suggest flooding, but enough to suggest recent traffic from a wet exterior. Poirot's eyes traveled along that trail, following it as one follows handwriting. It led to a service door. The crewman frowned. "That door's for supplies? We keep it bolted? And tonight?" Poirot asked gently. The crewman hesitated. "It should be." Poirot smiled faintly. "We are learning that schuld is a flexible word." The bolt was slid back. The door opened inward with a soft groan. Inside was a cramped storage space lined with stacked life jackets, coiled ropes, and sealed crates. A single bare bulb cast harsh light that sharpened every shadow into something suspicious. There was no body, no man crouched in terror, no sign of struggle, only the quiet order of stored equipment. The crewman exhaled in frustrated relief. See, nothing. Poirot stepped inside slowly, his gaze lowered. He did not search for a man first. He searched for disturbance. One crate had been shifted slightly from its aligned position. A coil of rope had been lifted and replaced carelessly. A life jacket strap hung loose. Poirot knelt and touched the floor beneath the crate tree. Then he moved his hand a few inches to the right, beneath the rope coil. Damp, he lifted his fingers and smelled them. Not lake water, not oil, something faintly sweet. Tea again, or something like it. Poirot straightened and turned to the crewman. "Was there any liquid spilled on deck earlier?" The crewman frowned. "A glass broke. Someone dropped it." "A glass of what?" Poirot asked. "Could have been anything." The crewman said, "People were drinking tea. Some had spirits." Poirot nodded slowly. The same faint sweetness he had smelled near the abandoned ledger. It was not proof, but it was continuity. A thread, the search continued through other compartments. Crew checked closets and storage bays, engine, adjacent corridors, and locked utility rooms. No Marcus Hale appeared. No body. No trace of a man hiding, or a man carried. The ferry, Poirot reflected, had swallowed him without swallowing him. That meant one of two things. Either Hale had reached the lower walkway and then gone into the water from a point hidden from the crowd above, or the vanishing had been a performance designed to make everyone look in the wrong direction while something else happened. Poirot returned to the cabin with that thought arranged neatly beside another, the missing leather case. A man could lose his life in a lake, but he could also lose it in a deal, quietly, efficiently, while the lake provided distraction. In the cabin lounge, the passengers had drifted back into uneasy conversation. The captain's officer stood watchfully near the door. Captain Reed remained on deck, smoking with a stiffness that suggested he was trying to hold himself together by force. Eleanor Hale sat alone near the window, her shawl drawn tight, her eyes fixed on nothing. Celia Marlowe remained near the corridor, quiet, her violin case still at her feet. Poirot moved to the bench where the abandoned ledger had been placed under guard. The steward had kept it secure, not out of understanding, but out of instinct. Poirot lifted the ledger carefully and carried it to the lounge table. He did not open it immediately. He waited until enough eyes were on him, until curiosity began to overpower fear. Then he spoke. "Mesdames and messieurs," Poirot said, his voice clear but not loud, "we will speak now of motive." A ripple passed through the room. People straightened. A few pretended not to listen, which was always a sign that they did. Poirot opened the ledger and flipped through the pages. At first glance, it was exactly what one would expect from a trader. Columns of numbers, dates, names of ports, codes that meant nothing to casual eyes. It was the sort of book that reassured people by its dullness. Poirot's fingers moved with calm certainty. He stopped at a particular section near the back. "Here," he said softly. He tilted the ledger so that those closest could see. Several pages had been marked. Subtly, but unmistakably, a corner folded. A faint pencil line along the margin. A small ink dot beside certain entries. Not the random markings of a man organizing his work, but the deliberate markings of a man preparing to use it. Poirot tapped one page gently. Names were circled. Not many. 3. Beside each name, an amount was written. Large, neat figures that stood apart from the usual columns, and beside those figures, in an even smaller hand, were short notes. Not business notes. Personal notes. Poirot did not read them aloud yet. He let the room lean toward the page, let the tension sharpen. "You see," Poirot said quietly, "Mr. Marcus Hale was not merely a trader. He was a collector of secrets." The scarfed man scoffed. "That's ridiculous. He was a quiet fellow." Poirot smiled faintly. Quiet men often hear the most. He turned a page revealing more markings. A few entries had been underlined twice. There were references to meetings, to payments, to dates that did not correspond with shipping schedules, and always the same 3 names appeared, like a motif in music, returning, repeating, insisting. Poirot lifted his eyes. "Blackmail," he said, "requires patience. It requires observation. It requires a mind that enjoys leverage more than profit." A collective unease spread. People shifted in their seats. Poirot's gaze drifted deliberately over faces. Captain Reed, visible through the cabin window on deck, stiffened as though feeling the words strike him through glass. Eleanor Hale inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her shawl. Celia Marlowe looked away, not in confusion, but in discomfort. Poirot noted each reaction with quiet satisfaction. The confrontation, Poirot continued, was not driven by anger. Anger is loud. It is careless. It makes mistakes. He touched the page again. This was driven by fear. He turned the ledger slightly toward the captain's officer, who frowned as he scanned the markings. Poirot did not need the man to understand every detail. He needed him to recognize that this was more than rumor, that it was written, recorded, planned. Mr. Hale circled names, Poirot said gently. He noted amounts. He recorded leverage. The scarfed man's voice rose. Whose names? Poirot held up a hand. In due time. He looked toward Eleanor Hale. Mrs. Hale, did your husband ever speak to you of money? Eleanor's face went pale. He said we would be safe soon, that everything would be settled. Poirot nodded. Safe, an interesting word. He turned toward the officer. Tell me, Poirot said, did Mr. Hale purchase his ticket in advance? Yes, the officer replied. He often did. Then he expected to make this journey, Poirot said. He did not intend to vanish. Poirot closed the ledger softly and folded his hands. Blackmail requires secrecy, he said. And secrecy creates desperation. The words settled over the room like a fog. Poirot opened the ledger again and pointed to the first circled name. He did not say it aloud yet, but he watched carefully as several eyes flicked, involuntarily, toward the same person. Captain Reed shifted outside, his cigarette hand pausing mid. Motion, Poirot pointed to the second circled name. Again, a flicker of attention moved. This time toward Eleanor, who flinched as though struck. Poirot pointed to the third. Celia's shoulders tightened. Though she did not look up, Poirot closed the book. You see, he said softly. Your minds already know, even if your lips do not. A hush fell. Even the engine seemed quieter for a moment. Poirot looked toward the cabin door, then out at the black lake beyond. The ferry continued forward, steady, indifferent. Somewhere ahead waited the shore, the patrol, the official questions. But Poirot knew that the real confrontation had already happened on this deck, under the fractured moon. A man with leverage had been confronted by someone with desperation. Fear, not anger, had driven the hand on the railing. And now the mystery sharpened to its most dangerous edge. If Marcus Hale was blackmailing someone aboard, then his vanishing was not an accident. It was an attempt, either to silence him or to reclaim what he carried. Poirot's gaze returned to the passengers, calm but penetrating. "Tell me," he said quietly, "who among you had the most to lose if Mr. Hale reached the far shore alive?" Chapter 8. The moment of truth, the ferry no longer felt like a vessel in motion. It felt like a stage. Every passenger sensed it now, even those who resisted the idea with crossed arms and skeptical expressions. The air had changed, not colder, not warmer, but heavier, as though the truth itself had begun to press downward. The engines continued their steady rhythm beneath the deck, but that sound had faded into irrelevance. All attention had gathered in one place, drawn by the quiet certainty of the small man standing near the rail. Hercule Poirot did not rush. He had learned long ago that revelations delivered too quickly lost their force. Truth, like music, required timing. A pause before the final note, a breath before the phrase resolved. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed, his gaze drifting not over faces but over spaces, gaps between people, angles of shadow, the geometry of the deck itself. The moon slipped free of cloud again, and its reflection fractured across the lake in pale, trembling bands. Poirot turned slowly to face the assembled passengers. "Mesdames and messieurs," he said calmly, "we are very close now, not to the end of this journey, but to the moment when everything changed." No one interrupted him. Captain Reed remained near the stern rail, arms folded, his stance wide and defensive. Eleanor Hale sat rigid on the bench near the cabin door, her shawl clenched in both hands. The scarfed man stood slightly apart, suddenly quiet. The thin man near the lifeboats watched with narrowed eyes, his body angled as though already calculating the crowd. An observer trained to read rooms rather than join them. He was not the danger tonight, Poirot decided, but the sort of man who always looked like it, and who benefited from that reputation. Celia Marlowe stood where she had before, silent and pale, her gaze fixed on Poirot, with the intensity of someone listening for a cue. Poirot gestured gently toward the water. "You have all been asking the same question," he continued. "How did Marcus Hale fall?" A few people shifted uneasily. "The answer," Poirot said, "is that he did not." A ripple moved through the group, not outrage this time, but something closer to reluctant understanding. Poirot took a few measured steps along the deck, stopping at the subtle break in the railing near the maintenance access. He did not touch it yet. He merely stood beside it, letting its presence speak. "You believed," Poirot said, "that Mr. Hale was thrown, or that he slipped, or that he leaned too far. These are comforting ideas. They allow you to imagine a single violent moment, a shove, a misstep, an accident." He turned back to them. But the truth is quieter and far more deliberate. Captain Reed shifted his weight. The boards creaked faintly beneath his boots. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the sound. "Yes," Poirot said softly. "You hear that?" The creak seemed suddenly loud. "This ferry," Poirot continued, "moves constantly. Even when it appears still, it shifts beneath your feet. It breathes, it tilts, it hums, and that motion can hide intention very well." He looked directly at Captain Reed now. "Mr. Hale was not thrown," Poirot said clearly. "He was cornered." A sharp intake of breath came from Eleanor Hale. The scarfed man frowned. The thin man near the lifeboat stiffened. Poirot did not rush to fill the silence. "Let us return," he said gently, "to the exact second that mattered." He closed his eyes briefly, not in theatrical flourish, but in concentration. "The scream," Poirot said. "It came first, not because Mr. Hale screamed. He did not. But because someone else saw what he was being forced to see. He opened his eyes and looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hale," Poirot said kindly, "you screamed when you saw your husband turn, when you saw fear on his face. That fear was real, but it was not caused by a sudden shove." Eleanor's lips trembled. She said nothing. Poirot continued. "It was caused by choice." Captain Reed's jaw tightened. Poirot took a step closer to the railing, then another, placing himself exactly where Celia Marlowe had indicated earlier. He stood sideways now, his left shoulder toward the cabin, his right toward the stern. "Mr. Hale stood here," Poirot said. He was facing the water, but his attention was not on it. His attention was behind him. He raised one hand, not touching the rail, but hovering just above it. Behind him stood another man. Poirot's gaze swept briefly across the group, then settled again on Captain Reed. "That man did not shout," Poirot said. "He did not grab. He did not push. Violence would have been too visible." Poirot lowered his hand, placing it gently on the railing. "Instead," he continued, "he blocked Mr. Hale's retreat." The words fell with precision. Captain Reed's foot shifted backward instinctively. The boards creaked again. Poirot did not miss it. "Yes," Poirot said softly. "Just so." Captain Reed flushed. "That proves nothing." Poirot smiled faintly. "On the contrary, it proves everything." He turned slightly, demonstrating the positions with his own body. "Imagine," Poirot said, "that Mr. Hale is here. He fears water. He cannot swim. He grips the rail. Behind him stands a man who knows this, a man who does not need to use force, only proximity." Poirot stepped closer to the rail, narrowing the space between himself and the edge. "He speaks quietly," Poirot continued. "He demands something. Papers, a case, leverage." Poirot's voice dropped. "Mr. Hale replies that he does not have it." Celia Marlowe's breath caught. Poirot went on. "The man behind him steps closer. Not touching, just closer, blocking the path back to safety." Poirot shifted again, now leaving himself no room between body and rail. "The ferry tilts," Poirot said, "just a little enough to remind Mr. Hale of where he stands." He paused. "The man behind him does not need to push," Poirot said. "He only needs to wait." Captain Reed's breathing had changed. It was heavier now, less controlled. Poirot turned fully toward him. "You see," Poirot said gently, "fear is a powerful force. It convinces people that the only choice is the one they dread most." Reed's voice came out hoarse. "You're saying he jumped?" Poirot shook his head. "Number, I am saying he chose between two terrors." The deck was utterly silent now, Poirot continued, his voice steady. "Behind him stood a man who could ruin him or kill him in another way. In front of him was water he feared, but which promised an end to the moment." Poirot spread his hands slightly. The ferry's motion masked the intention. To an observer, it looked like a slip. To those looking at reflections, it looked like a fall. To those desperate for comfort, it became an accident. He looked back at the water, but in truth, it was a decision forced by circumstance. Captain Reed laughed harshly. "That's a story." Poirot turned to him calmly. "Yes, but unlike yours, it explains every contradiction." Reed opened his mouth, then closed it. Poirot gestured toward the scarfed man. "You heard raised voices. That is true. Fear raises voices." He gestured toward the older man with spectacles. "You heard silence. That is also true. Negotiation can be quiet." He gestured toward Eleanor. "You saw a shadow. That too is true." Because the man stood close enough to eclipse the light. He gestured toward Celia. "And you saw the hand, the left hand, bare steady, not striking, controlling." Poirot's gaze returned to Captain Reed. "And you," Poirot said softly, "you saw the moment after. You saw a man vanish. And you did what sailors often do when confronted with chaos. You imposed order." Reed shook his head violently. "I didn't kill him," Poirot nodded. "Number, you did not." The admission landed like a blow, Poirot continued. You believed it was better for everyone to believe it was an accident. You believed panic would hurt more people. You believed that certainty, even false certainty, was mercy. Reed's shoulders sagged slightly. But, Poirot said gently, you also blocked the truth. Reed swallowed hard. Poirot turned away from him now, addressing the group again. The killer, Poirot said, relied on confusion, on reflection, on motion, on the human tendency to look outward when danger appears, rather than inward. He took a step toward the thin man near the lifeboats, and he relied on one more thing, Poirot said quietly, that no one would notice the exact second when choice replaced accident. Poirot let his gaze drift deliberately to the edge of the group, not as an accusation, but as a net cast wide enough to catch the guilty flinch. The thin man stiffened. Poirot stopped a few paces from him. Summoning was close enough, Poirot said. Close enough for a hand to appear beside Mr. Hales on the rail, close enough to block his retreat, close enough to let fear do the work. The man laughed shortly. You have no proof. Poirot inclined his head. Proof is coming for now. We speak of the moment. He turned back to the group once more. Mr. Hale did not fall at the scream, Poirot said. He fell in the silence immediately after, when eyes turned, when attention fractured, when the ferry shifted just enough to make fear irresistible. He looked at Eleanor Hale, his voice softening. He chose the water, Poirot said gently, because it seemed, in that instant, the lesser terror. Eleanor covered her mouth, a sob breaking free at last. Poirot bowed his head slightly in respect, then straightened. Silence, Poirot said, has now confirmed what words could not. No one spoke. Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. Poirot remained standing there, small and composed against the vast darkness, having done what he always did best. Not accuse too early, not shout too loudly, but reveal the precise moment when truth replaced illusion. And everyone aboard the ferry now understood that the mystery was no longer about how Marcus Hale vanished, but about who had stood behind him when he did. Chapter 9. The confession. The ferry seemed to pause, not in movement, but in spirit. Its engines continued their steady labor beneath the deck. The water still parted obediently at its bow. Yet something essential had shifted. The moment Poirot had named choice, the illusion of accident collapsed. No one could return to the comfort of misstep and chance. What remained was weight, moral, emotional, and inescapable. Silence held the deck in a careful grip. Captain Reed stood very still near the stern rail. The confidence that had once anchored him now looked brittle, like a structure held upright by habit, rather than strength. His arms were no longer folded. His hands hung at his sides, fingers flexing as though searching for something solid to grasp. Poirot did not look at him immediately. He had learned that a confession forced too quickly was often incomplete. A man needed to hear his own thoughts echo in silence before he could speak them aloud. Around them, the passengers waited, some rigid, some trembling. Eleanor Hale sat hunched on the bench, her shoulders shaking with quiet, contained sobs. Celia Marlowe had closed her eyes, as though sealing away the image she could not unsee. The scarfed man stared at the deckboards, with the stunned expression of someone realizing that his certainty had been borrowed, not earned. The thin man near the lifeboats had edged farther back, calculating distances, exits, risks. Poirot finally turned to Captain Reed. You said earlier, Poirot began calmly, that you had seen men fall overboard many times. Beard swallowed. Yes. And you said, Poirot continued, that it happens fast. Too fast for drama. Reed nodded, though his eyes did not lift. Poirot took a step closer, not threateningly, but deliberately. Then you know, he said gently. The difference between a fall and a decision. Beard's jaw tightened. I didn't touch him, Reed said suddenly, his voice rough, almost defiant. The words burst out as though he had been holding them back with effort. I never laid a hand on him. Poirot inclined his head. I know. The admission seemed to unmoor Reed more than accusation would have. He looked up sharply, startled. You know. Reed demanded. Yes, Poirot replied. And yet here we are. Reed let out a short, humorless laugh. That's not fair. Poirot's voice remained steady. Truth rarely feels fair to the one who must carry it. Reed's gaze dropped again, fixed on the deck near his boots. The boards creaked faintly as the ferry shifted. He was blackmailing me, Reed said at last. The words rippled through the group like a sudden change in current. Eleanor Hale's sob caught sharply. Celia's eyes opened, wide and pained. The scarfed man inhaled audibly. Poirot nodded once. Not surprised. Yes. Reed's shoulders slumped slightly. He came to me weeks ago, said he had papers, records, things that could end me. End you how? Poirot asked gently. Reed's voice turned bitter. You think I've lived cleanly my whole life? I've bent rules, looked the other way, helped things move that shouldn't have. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, just favors. Poirot listened without interruption. He had dates, Reed continued, names, payments. Said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure the right people saw it. My pension, my reputation, everything gone. Poirot's gaze flicked briefly to the ledger, resting on the bench nearby. He kept careful notes. Reed nodded. He always did. That was the worst of it. He wasn't angry. He was calm, like it was just another transaction. Celia's fingers curled slightly, as though pressing invisible strings. And tonight? Poirot asked. Reed closed his eyes briefly. Tonight he said he wanted the case back. The leather case, Poirot murmured. Yes, Reed said. He said he'd hidden it somewhere on the ferry earlier, that he didn't trust carrying it openly. He wanted assurance before we docked. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Assurance of what? That I'd keep paying, Reed said bitterly. That I'd keep quiet. And you? Poirot asked. Reed's lips trembled. I told him I didn't have the money anymore, that I couldn't keep doing it. Poirot nodded, and he did not accept that. No, Reed whispered. He smiled. A silence followed, thick, heavy understanding. A smile, Poirot knew, could terrify more than any shout. He said, Reed continued, then you'll have to choose which ruin you prefer. Eleanor Hale let out a low, broken sound. Poirot's voice softened. So you followed him onto the deck. I thought if I spoke to him quietly, if I reasoned. But fear reasoned faster, Poirot said gently. Reed nodded. I knew he hated the water. I knew it scared him. Poirot did not interrupt. I stood behind him, Reed said, his voice hollow now. I didn't plan to do anything. I swear that. I just stood there, too close. I told him he was ruining lives. I told him he'd regret it. Poirot's gaze remained steady, and the ferry shifted. Reed nodded. Just a little. Enough. And you blocked his retreat, Poirot said. Not accusing, merely stating. Reed's shoulders shook once. I didn't think he'd. But you knew he might, Poirot said quietly. Reed's breath shuddered. Yes. The word fell like a confession all its own. I knew, Reed said again. Louder now, as if saying it twice might empty it of weight. I knew he might jump. The deck seemed to exhale. Eleanor Hale sobbed openly now, her hands pressed to her face. The sound was raw, unguarded. It stripped away the last layer of abstraction, leaving only grief. Celia Marlowe closed her eyes again, this time not in restraint, but in mourning. Poirot inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect, not approval, but acknowledgement. You believed, Poirot said softly, that it would look like an accident. Reed nodded. Yes, that the ferry would keep moving, that people would panic, that they'd look at the water and not at me. And they did, Poirot said. Reed let out a broken laugh. They helped me. Poirot's gaze turned briefly toward the others. They helped without knowing, Poirot said gently, by misremembering, by repeating the simplest story, by lending certainty where there was none. The scarfed man flushed deeply. I didn't mean. Poirot raised a hand. I know. He turned back to Reed. You did not push him, Poirot said. That is true. Reed nodded desperately. I swear it. Poirot's voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable gravity. But you placed him in a position where fear could do the work for you. Your Reed's head bowed. Intent, Poirot continued, is heavier than action. Reed's shoulders shook again. I never wanted him dead. Poirot did not argue. Many do not. Yet they build the moment in which death becomes inevitable. The ferry horn sounded in the distance, long, low, a signal to the approaching shore. The sound felt like a countdown. Poirot glanced toward the thin man near the lifeboats. The man had gone very still, his earlier calculation now useless. He understood, as everyone did, that the focus had narrowed. Poirot spoke again. His tone inclusive now, addressing not only Reed but the group. Guilt, Poirot said, rarely belongs to one man alone. One man creates the moment. Others support it, through fear, through comfort, through the desire for a simple explanation. He gestured gently toward the deck, the water, the moon's reflection. The sea merely obeyed gravity. No one contradicted him. Poirot turned to the captain's officer. You will find the leather case, Poirot said calmly. It was not thrown into the water. It was never meant to be lost. Search the supply locker off the lower walkway, behind the rope coils and life jackets. You will smell the spilled sweet tea before you see the scuff marks. The officer nodded, his face pale but resolute. Poirot returned his attention to Reed. You will answer for what you did. Your Reed nodded slowly. I know. He straightened, some of the old sailor's dignity returning. Not defiance now, but acceptance. I thought I was protecting order. Poirot's eyes softened slightly. Order built on fear collapses into chaos. Reed looked toward Eleanor Hale, who had finally lifted her face. Their eyes met for a brief, unbearable second. I'm sorry, Reed whispered. Eleanor did not answer. Her silence was heavier than any condemnation. Poirot stepped back, allowing space to form around the confession. The truth no longer needed him to carry it alone. It had settled among them, undeniable, unmovable. As the ferry drew closer to shore, its lights merging with those ahead, Poirot felt the familiar, quiet sadness that accompanied the end of every case. Not satisfaction, but resolution weighted with human cost. He looked once more at the lake. The water remained calm, indifferent, unchanged. It had not judged. It had not chosen. It had merely obeyed gravity and the rest. The fear, the intent, the silence had belonged entirely to men. Chapter 10. Constellations aligned dawn arrived without ceremony. It did not announce itself with color or brilliance at first, but with a thinning of darkness, an easing, as though night had decided it could no longer justify its own weight. The harbor lights still burned, pale and tired, while the stars above them faded one by one, relinquishing their places in the sky with quiet obedience. The ferry slowed. Its engines changed tone, the steady vibration easing into something measured and deliberate. Water gathered differently along the hull, now no longer torn open by forward motion, but folding back upon itself in soft, converging ripples. The lake, which had borne witness without expression, settled into a surface. So still it seemed almost unreal. Truth, Poirot reflected, often arrived this way, without triumph, without spectacle, simply present, undeniable in its calm. Passengers stood along the rail and near the cabin windows, watching the shoreline grow clearer. No one spoke loudly anymore. Conversations, when they occurred at all, were brief and subdued. Each person seemed absorbed, not in the harbor ahead, but in the interior harbor of their own thoughts, where memory and understanding were rearranging themselves into a new, less comfortable order. Captain Reed stood apart, flanked discreetly by the captain's officer and another crewman. His hands were no longer hidden in his pockets. They hung openly at his sides, empty. He looked older now, not because a night had passed, but because something he had carried for years had finally been set down, and the effort of holding it had been revealed in its absence. Eleanor Hale sat near the cabin door, wrapped in her shawl, as though it were both shield and anchor. Her eyes were red, but dry now. Grief had moved beyond shock into something deeper and more enduring. It had weight. It would not be hurried. Celia Marlowe stood nearby, her violin case still at her feet. She had not moved it all night. It was as if she needed the reminder of something precise and ordered, something that obeyed rules and resolved into harmony when treated with care. She stared out at the water, but not as she had earlier, not searching reflections, not reading signs, but simply looking. Poirot remained where he had stood for some time now. Near the rail, slightly forward of center, he watched the harbor emerge with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had finished his work and was content to let events conclude without interference. The ferry eased into its berth with a gentle thud, ropes thrown and secured with practiced efficiency. The sound of water against the hull changed again, becoming a series of soft, repetitive taps rather than the long hiss of movement. It was over, and yet, Poirot knew, endings were rarely clean. They were composed of many smaller endings, beliefs relinquished, certainties dismantled, guilt redistributed. The captain's officer approached him quietly. "The patrol is waiting," he said. "They'll take Captain Reed." Poirot nodded. "Yes." The officer hesitated. "You were right, about all of it." Poirot offered a small, polite smile. "I was right, because many people were honest, some sooner than others." The officer glanced toward the passengers. "They're asking questions about what they saw, about what they thought they saw." Poirot's expression softened. "They will, and that is as it should be." The officer nodded and stepped away. Captain Reed was led forward then, not roughly, not ceremoniously, but with the quiet firmness reserved for men who no longer resist. As he passed Eleanor Hale, he stopped. "I am sorry," he said again, his voice low and unsteady. "I know it changes nothing." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said softly. "It does not." Her voice held no hatred, no forgiveness, only truth. Reed nodded once, then allowed himself to be guided onward. The crew parted around him instinctively, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. He was no longer the man who explained the world for them. He was simply a man within it. Poirot watched him go, his expression grave but not judgmental. Justice, he knew, was not his role to administer, only truth. As the patrol took Reed away, Poirot turned back to the remaining passengers. Many of them looked at him now with something like expectation. Others avoided his gaze, embarrassed by how eagerly they had accepted comfort over complexity. Poirot stepped forward slightly, addressing them without elevation of voice. "You have all endured a difficult night," he said gently. "It is natural to wish for a single explanation, a clean line from cause to effect." Several heads nodded. "But," Poirot continued, "life rarely offers us such simplicity. What happened here was not the act of one man alone, nor the failure of one moment." He gestured lightly toward the water. "It was the convergence of many things: fear, secrecy, habit, motion, and most of all, assumption." The scarfed man shifted uncomfortably. The older man with spectacles stared at the deck. "You each held a piece," Poirot said. "A sound, a silence, a shadow, a reflection. None of you were wrong, and yet none of you were complete." He paused, letting the words settle. "Truth," Poirot continued, "is not a single witness. It is a pattern." He lifted his gaze to the sky, where the last faint stars still lingered, barely visible against the growing light. "Like constellations," Poirot said softly. "One star alone tells us little, but when aligned, when seen in relation to one another, they reveal a shape." Celia Marlowe looked up at that, her eyes following his gaze. "I watched reflections," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I thought that made me distant." Poirot turned to her with a gentle smile. On the contrary, mademoiselle, it made you precise. She nodded once, as though accepting something she had not yet named. Poirot turned then to Eleanor Hale. He approached her slowly, respectfully, stopping at a distance that allowed choice. Mrs. Hale, he said softly, your husband was a complicated man. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her shawl. Yes. He did wrong, Poirot continued gently, but he did not deserve what happened. No, she agreed. Poirot inclined his head. I am sorry for your loss. She looked at him then, really looked at him. You listened, she said, when others didn't. Poirot's voice was quiet. Listening is often the only way to hear the truth. The harbor had fully awakened now. Dock workers moved about their business. A gull cried overhead. The ordinary sounds of morning resumed, indifferent to the night that had preceded them. Passengers began to disembark slowly, some casting one last glance at the deck, as though hoping to fix it in memory. Others hurried away, eager to escape the weight of reflection. Poirot remained until the flow thinned. At last, only a few remained. The crew, Eleanor, Celia, and Poirot himself. Poirot stepped toward the rail one final time and looked out at the water. It lay smooth and untroubled, reflecting the pale sky with perfect indifference. There was no sign of struggle, no mark of what it had taken. The lake did not keep records. It did not accuse. The water returns to silence, Poirot murmured. Celia heard him and nodded. But we don't. Poirot smiled faintly. Number, and that is the difference. He adjusted his hat with habitual care, a small, grounding gesture that marked the end of his involvement. The harbor breeze stirred his coat lightly as he stepped onto the gangway. Behind him, the ferry rested at last, its night complete. Ahead of him lay the shore, the city, the next request, the next mystery that would demand patience and attention. Poirot paused at the bottom of the gangway and looked back once more. The deck was empty now, but in his mind, the constellations were clear. Each perspective aligned, each contradiction resolved into pattern. What had been fractured by fear had become whole through understanding. Poirot turned away and stepped ashore, carrying with him not triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of order restored, not by force, but by reason. Above the harbor, the last star vanished, and the case, reflected and whole, was complete.